Chapter 189. North of the Iferta territory, deep in the Lars mountain range. The leaden sky was gloomy and oppressive, making it hard for people to breathe. At such a high altitude, the air was thin and the environment was extreme. Therefore, there was no sign of human habitation in the entire mountain range. Among the vast snow-capped mountains, there was a figure walking indifferently. He was the undead Ansadin. The biting cold wind had no effect on him. Ansadin walked with mechanical precision, as if he was walking on a flat road. His face was pale, and his skin sagged like an ugly mask. There was a hint of malevolence in his indifference. The coarse cloth robe hanging on his body made Ansadin look very thin. However, his gray eyes always revealed a kind of indifferent arrogance, as if the entire world was under his gaze. As the first apprentice of the Tasman Kingdom's royal pharmacist, Ansadin had just turned 86 this year. For undead who had a long life, this was almost the same as puberty. Most undead at this age had just awakened their self-awareness. However, Ansadin had already become the youngest royal pharmacist in the history of the kingdom with his strong talent in potion-making. Not only that, he had also won the appreciation of King Augustine because of the soul extraction potion, which gave him the precious opportunity to go out and carry out missions. For the old guys in the political circle of the Tasman Kingdom, Ansadin deserved the title of the most favored genius pharmacist in the past 50 years. Ansadin had personally carried out the corrosion plan in the Kingdom of Karen for 17 years. Not only had he succeeded in infiltrating a large number of spies into the Kingdom of Karen, but he had also gained control of several great nobles. With such achievements, his status in the past few years had naturally been rising, even to the point where he was on equal footing with the blighters. The overly smooth situation made Ansadin even more arrogant, and even a little conceited. But recently, something unexpected had happened to the corrosion plan. The soul extraction potion had lost its effectiveness, the undercover alpha had been exposed, and Angmar had recovered and awakened. This situation was equivalent to a slap in the face to Ansadin, who was waiting to earn merits, so his only response was to issue an assassination order. As soon as the order was given, Ansadin, who had sent the blighters to hold the line, never thought about the possibility of the assassination failing. The only thing he was worried about was how to explain his mistake to King Augustine. But he didn't expect that the originally foolproof plan would actually have another problem. A horse caw came from the sky. When he looked up, he saw a huge black crow swooping down and landing steadily on the rock in front of Ansadin. He casually took the letter, thinking that he would see a formal report on the completion of the mission, but the information written on it made Ansadin clench his fists. This is impossible. The assassination team was ambushed. A trap was set up in Hollier. The blighters escaped with serious injuries, and the rest of the team was annihilated. The Dukes of Angmar were unharmed, but the mastermind was an unknown scout captain. Ansadin's arms trembled slightly. He held the letter in his hand, and his mind was in complete chaos. Surprise, shock, anger, doubt. All kinds of emotions were stuck in his chest, and a layer of faint gray mist appeared around Ansadin's body. This was not ice, but the aura of death that he had mastered after advancing to level 10 necromancer. Because the ambush happened in a completely sealed area, there were not many witnesses, so the letter was vague about the process of the battle. It only said that Magda was heavily injured due to carelessness, and Hollier was premeditated, and the culprit was identified as Superintendent Rubens, who cast the divine spell. As for the scout captain, who was only a strategist, he was only mentioned briefly in the letter. The blighters can also fail. After all kinds of emotions, Ansadin quickly calmed down. But the first thing he thought about was not to find Magda's whereabouts, but to find a scapegoat. There was no turning back for the potion's failure, but the great blighters messed up the assassination, so don't blame me for hitting you when you're down. Magda was a vengeful person, and Ansadin was not a good person either. Ansadin was very clear about the Blighters' personality. They were eager for revenge, and would definitely come to him for help. If he agreed to repair their body, it would be a huge favor. And how to make them take the blame, and at the same time be grateful to him, this was a skill. Ansadin squinted his eyes, and his gray pupils flashed with a strange light. Politicians always used all kinds of means to gain benefits, and he had always done it thoroughly. As a necromancer with a base level of 15 and advanced to level 10, Ansadin never participated in a battle personally, because he specialized in the puppetry of the necromancer. As for the battle situation, Ansadin always stood at a higher position than the average person, because he always thought of himself as the controller of the chessboard. No matter who the opponent was, all he had to do was to place the chess pieces, surround and kill, and the opponent would never be able to turn the tables. Personally charge into battle? That was something only a brainless person would do. Scout Captain, huh? What a joke. He looked at the place marked on the letter, and his eyes looked into the distance, as if he wanted to see through the hundreds of kilometers to see the culprit called Roddy. Raising his hand, Ansadin took out a bottle of dark green potion from his bag, and poured it into his mouth. After a cold breath of death circulated in his body, he took out the white elder wand, and sprinkled a handful of gray bone powder into the wind. The curse of the dead echoed in the thin air, and 2 stone statues with a reserved color were found. The statue was only the size of a palm, shaped like a demon, with bat wings on its back. It was a gargoyle with the ability to fly. With a wave of the wand, a complete summoning circle was drawn by Ansadin skillfully in the air, and the puppet's summoning circle, with a faint fluorescent light, was immediately completed. With a wave of his wand, the originally thin aura of death suddenly became several times denser, and the light of the magic circle shone brightly. After the final incantation, Ansadin threw the 2 sculptures into the magic circle, and he chanted the full name of the spell in a low voice. Summon, Gargoyle. As a necromancer who specialized in the puppet, although Ansadin's level was not high, after advancing to level 10, he could only summon 1 level 10 gargoyle, but under the strengthening of the summoning stabilizing potion, Ansadin was ready to summon 2. The moment the statue passed through the invisible circle, it turned into a huge black shadow, and its more than 4 meters long bat wings spread out. The gargoyle's muscles were angular, and its sharp claws were as long as daggers. When it landed on the rocks, it easily crushed the solid rocks. The level of the gargoyle was fixed, and the level 1 summoning spell could only summon a level 10 gargoyle. Although it was not high, it could fly, and there was no time limit for summoning, so it was very powerful. In this era where most people used cold weapons, it had the advantage of air superiority, and it was almost invincible. Magda, I have to say sorry this time. Ansadin leaped up and landed directly on the back of the gargoyle. He tightened the bag containing the new poison and disappeared into the vast mountains in an instant. Will this work? It's not up to me to decide, but we have to try to know. But those books, I won't reveal any information. You can rest assured. In the tree hollow of Elsa village, Roddy and Brody were still talking. The hierarchy of the wood elves was too simple. The village chief had the final say, and there was no such thing as an elder or a council system. Therefore, Roddy only needed to discuss the business plan of Elsa village with Brody alone. It's almost winter, and the only thing the village can bring out is the prey brought by the beast tide. We don't have much fruit wine, and we can only increase the production next year. But I think it's completely meaningless for us to exchange them for money. You don't have to worry about it. They won't all change currencies. Brody knew that there was nothing else he needed to say. He sighed and then said, Natha told me about her request. If it was someone else, I wouldn't agree, but she. My only request is that you take good care of her. Roddy, who was originally full of business plans, immediately felt a headache when he heard this. bringing along a wood elf, especially a beautiful one to explore the human world, was really not something that could save energy. But who asked him to be short-handed? I'll try my best. After roughly explaining, Roddy got up and left. When he walked out of the tree hollow, Henry, who was roasting meat at the edge of the village, hurriedly got up to greet him. After receiving 2 different treatments from Brody and Akasha, Fatty, who was originally on the verge of death, was now full of vigor and energy. Moreover, he was very enthusiastic towards Roddy. Buffon, who was at the side, was kicked by Henry. He then got up and saluted Roddy. Compared to Henry, Buffon was a bit more inarticulate. When no one paid attention to him, he would be silent. Occasionally, he would chat with Fatty. Throughout the day, he only showed obedience to Roddy like a robot. Fatty and Skinny were both by the bonfire. As their former teammate, Akasha had gradually regained her mobility after 2 days of rest. At this moment, she was sitting on a rock in a daze. Although she said that she was in a daze, her mental state was not very good. Especially every time Roddy disappeared from her sight, Akasha would show an indescribable anxiety. Her lips would turn white, her fingers would clench into fists, and her body would tremble. These symptoms would only be completely relieved when she saw Roddy. Just like now, when she saw Roddy jump down from the tree hollow, her tensed little face slowly relaxed. Her gaze, however, seemed to be glued to Roddy. No matter where he went, she would stare at him without blinking. Chapter 190. Looking at the pitiful Akasha, Roddy was actually a little disappointed. What he wanted was a healer who could help, not a burden who had no ability to take care of herself. If it was in the game, and there was a beautiful female player who needed an expert to lead the team, a large number of people would rush up to her. But now it was reality. A team annihilation was a team annihilation. There was no such thing as resurrection in the graveyard. Roddy didn't want to see Akasha shivering in the corner when he needed healing. Rather than that, it was better to give up early and find a more reliable one. Akasha's level was high, but her mental state was unexpected to Roddy. Fortunately, he didn't expect her to do anything immediately. For such a good-looking nanny, whether to leave or stay, Roddy finally decided to see if she could recover. He walked to the campfire and sat down. Before he spoke, Henry courteously handed over the roasted wild boar meat. Roddy took a bite and found it surprisingly delicious. He nodded and said, "This meat is roasted really well." Henry chuckled and didn't dare to respond because he still didn't know what kind of temper his employer had. "Do you feel better now?" Roddy asked Akasha, who nodded quickly. Although her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes had eased a lot. Seeing that Roddy was so concerned about her, she whispered, "Thank you," but before she finished speaking, she saw Roddy take out a few strangely shaped fruits from his pocket, and then he reached out and handed them to her. "You need to eat more meat, and you need to eat these fruits too." Roddy knew that she was anemic, so these nutrients must be kept up. He added, "This is an order." And, "Got it." Akasha was surprisingly quiet. She nodded, and then she got up and sat directly next to Roddy. Roddy, who was eating grease all over his mouth, was stunned. He tilted his head and looked at Akasha, who was eating the fruit as if nothing had happened. He thought, what does this mean? There was only a distance of 3 to 4 centimeters between them. When he inhaled, Roddy could even smell the faint fragrance on Akasha's body. This scene seemed a little ambiguous, but Roddy was really not in the mood to flirt at the moment. He was not used to sitting so close to a woman he was not familiar with, so he quietly moved his body to the side. The next moment, Akasha moved horizontally without any change in expression, still sticking close to Roddy. Roddy's face twitched a little, and he bluntly said, "Can you not sit so close?" What happened to you?" "I'm scared," Akasha murmured, then lowered her head and stopped talking. Roddy rubbed his brows and swallowed back the words he wanted to say. He knew that the other party had been traumatized and was in a weak state of mind. He couldn't treat him like a normal person now, but I've never learned how to communicate with a mental patient. Roddy sighed helplessly. In the end, he could only let Akasha sit next to him. He bowed his head and continued to eat the barbecue, treating Akasha as a soft cushion with fragrance. "Fatty, your meat is burnt." Oh, I forgot to turn it over. Sorry. Henry, who was sitting opposite, quickly bowed his head and continued to barbecue in silence after hearing what Roddy said. He could keep a straight face, but his heart really couldn't. Akasha's figure and appearance were definitely superior. Not to mention in Kyger Town, it was probably impossible to find such a stunner in the entire Ifta territory. Such a delicate beauty sitting next to him. If it was an ordinary person, they would have long been yearning for it. But why does this guy look disgusted? He wouldn't like men, right? Henry shuddered, but he didn't dare to show any emotion on his face. He was very clear that the Iron Horse mercenary group had become history. His and Buffon's next fate, to a large extent, depended on the mission that the other party arranged for them. Roddy's strength was so powerful, but he saved his and Henry's lives for no reason. No matter how he thought about it, the mission that this mysterious guy arranged for him and Buffon must be very dangerous. What would he do? Face the vicious beast? Look for precious herbs? Or assassinate someone that he couldn't deal with personally? Henry was a little nervous, but he didn't escape. "Well, today let's formally introduce each other. Tell me what you are good at." Roddy withdrew his gaze from Akasha and asked Henry in front of him with quite an imposing manner. As for Buffon, who was sitting dumbly at the side, he didn't expect him to say anything. "I was the one who went to resell the things that the mercenary group harvested. I'm quite familiar with Kyger Town and several nearby towns." Roddy nodded and secretly thought that his luck was good. He actually found a suitable talent. When his gaze turned to Buffon, Henry rushed to continue. "Buffon is good at pathfinding and unlocking. His nose is good, so he can avoid danger every time he goes out on a mission in the forest." Obviously, these two people had their own strengths, but the only thing they weren't good at was fighting. Henry also said something else. He said that they had a wide network in Kyger Town and were well informed, which made Roddy look at them in a different light. It wasn't because of the things that the fatty bragged about, but because the other party was good at catching the main point. He obviously knew that he and Buffon were saved by Roddy because they were born in Kyger Town. So, the topic of the conversation always revolved around this point. Smart and smart. Roddy had a good impression of this chattering fatty. It didn't matter if you liked to brag, as long as you had the real ability. "Okay, then get ready. In a few days, the two of you will go to Kyger Town. I will arrange a mission for you." "Yes." Henry immediately responded. The dull Buffon next to him also hurriedly stood up, but his movements were slow, which looked a little funny. "So, what about you?" Roddy turned his gaze to Akasha. The latter was close to him with her head down to eat fruit. When she heard that, she looked up slightly and replied timidly, "I know some magic that can heal wounds." "I didn't ask you this. I asked you if you want to go with them to Kyger Town? If you want to go home." "I don't have a home. I don't want to go." When she heard that Roddy wanted to send her away, Akasha's little face that had just calmed down instantly turned pale, and even her voice was a little trembling. Roddy covered his face and said in his heart that he really shouldn't communicate with a mental patient. Fortunately, the appearance of Natha helped Roddy out. The wood elf came over with an animal skin package. She ignored the other people and directly handed the package to Roddy. Then she stood there waiting for a reply. Roddy opened it and looked at it. Then he handed it to Henry and asked, "Since you are familiar with Kyger Town, then help me see if these herbs can be sold in Kyger Town?" The fatty was an expert in reselling goods. He took the package and looked at it. He was a little surprised and said, "Silver leaf? Such good quality is rare." This is wood spirit mushroom, snake-tail flower? And it's even an adult one? Henry was very good at identifying herbs because mercenaries would always collect some herbs in the forest and sell them back. But obviously, he had never seen so many well-preserved and high-quality herbs. Among them, there were even some precious varieties that were sold at a very high price in Kiger Town. It's not cost-effective to sell these herbs directly. If you really want to make money, I think you can find a pharmacist, pay the production fees, and then sell them. That way you can make more money. Of course, he didn't waste more than 10 years in Kiger Town. Henry also pointed to one of them and said, "There are many places in the town that sell Dracaena, but there are almost no more than 20 years old. The Pharmacist Association has been offering a reward for this material, and the purchase price is more than 10 times the price." Roddy really didn't expect this fatty to be so knowledgeable. He had a feeling of picking up a treasure in his heart, but he didn't show too much strangeness. He just looked up and asked Natha, "Are there only so many herbs?" "There's one of each, and a lot more." Natha's tone was always calm, as if everything had nothing to do with her. But at this time, her eyes stayed on Akasha, who was closely clinging to Roddy for a moment, and then moved away as if nothing had happened. Roddy didn't notice this. He chatted with Henry about the value of the herbs, but he had some new ideas in his heart. He turned his head in a good mood and said to Natha, "I have discussed it with Village Chief Brody. We will leave here tomorrow morning." Natha was slightly stunned. She was very clear that when Roddy said he was going to leave, it was time for her to leave. Although she had already made up her mind, she still felt a little strange on the day of departure. "I know," she replied in a low voice, and then added a suffix that made Roddy's mouth twitch, "teacher." After that, Natha turned and left. The sky gradually turned dark, and dusk soon arrived. In Elsa's village, the atmosphere in Roddy's temporary camp was very calm. Henry and Buffon were sleeping and trying their best to recover their strength. Roddy, on the other hand, wandered around the village a few times. He also borrowed a copy of The Essence of Energy from Brody, which he had found in the ruins of Wagra. He was prepared to flip through it and study it. The old elf didn't say much about his curiosity and acquiesced to his privilege. When it was dark, Roddy asked Henry and Buffon to go back early to rest. But what gave him a headache was that Akasha didn't seem to be able to sleep well alone. The tents in the camp were simple, and one person could barely lie down. Roddy asked Akasha to rest in her own tent, but he found that her eyes were red, and she was tugging at the corner of his clothes and wouldn't let him go. After much persuasion, Roddy finally got rid of her and returned to his tent. Just as he was about to take off his clothes and lie down, he found that Akasha, who was in her pajamas, had already squeezed into his side. Roddy suddenly felt a headache. "Why did you come to my tent? Go back and rest, this is an order." He found that the word order was quite useful to Akasha, but it was only useful during the day. Now that it was dark, this patient with phobia of darkness really couldn't stay calm at all. "I don't want to go. I'm scared, can you accompany me?" This was the truth. Akasha was scared to death. Although she was sleeping in a tent, the boundless darkness around her was like a mountain when she closed her eyes, and she couldn't breathe at all. So she had no choice but to run to Roddy's tent, because she found that only by staying with this guy in front of her, her fear would gradually fade. Akasha didn't know why she became like this. Although she knew that it was inappropriate for a man and a woman to squeeze into a tent alone, if she didn't do this, she was afraid that she would immediately be driven crazy by the fear that was crazily gushing out of her head. Roddy was completely helpless. Fortunately, he was born not sensitive to women, and his heart belonged to someone else. So even if Akasha's devilish figure was swaying in front of him, and he had evil thoughts like pouncing on her and eating her in his mind, it wasn't that he couldn't suppress it. The only thing he was distressed about was how to solve this tricky problem. Chapter 191. Mental illness in this era was attributed to illusory spells such as illusion curse, but as a modern person, Roddy's view of these illnesses was much more objective. Roddy understood claustrophobia, agoraphobia, and darkness phobia, so he was very clear that Akasha's current situation was indeed terrible. If she had the slightest ability to think, she would not directly enter Roddy's tent. "Stop first, don't drill." I won't go, and you don't move either. I'll talk and you listen, okay?" The thin and simple tent finally stopped swaying. In the small space, Akasha shrunk into a ball in fear. Roddy helplessly covered his face, only smelling the faint fragrance of her body. What is this called? Does an otaku also have a spring? Thinking back to the time when he was in the game, he was like a lone star, unloved by his grandmother and uncles. As a result, after transmigrating, his luck with women seemed to be dozens of times better than before. It was really sad and lamentable. If it was an ordinary person, perhaps the only thing they would think of was to take advantage of the situation, but Roddy had never relaxed his vigilance towards Akasha. Although he hoped that this divine priest could join the team to help, he really did not dare to casually trust her before he knew her background. So after stopping Akasha, Roddy bluntly said, "I know you are afraid, but I want to ask, what are you afraid of?" "I am afraid of the dark." The tent was dark at this time. When Akasha said this, her fingers were tightly grasping Roddy's arm. Under extreme fear, her actions were completely instinctive, and she had no ability to think at all. "Relax," I said, "relax." Roddy spent a long time to pry Akasha's hand away. After thinking for a while, he directly raised his hand and activated the light on the ring. When the soft light appeared, Roddy could clearly feel that Akasha's body seemed to relax a lot. Her slightly red eyes stared at the glowing ring, and her somewhat rapid breathing gradually calmed down. "Are you feeling better now? And that's good. I happen to have some questions for you. Sit here and answer them." Akasha hurriedly nodded, but her body moved closer to Roddy, as if she wanted to be closer to the light. Roddy had nowhere to hide, so he could only lean back and say, "Tell me about your past. Where did you come from, and how did you meet me in that damned place?" He originally thought that Akasha would evade or refuse to say anything, but he never thought that she would immediately reveal everything without hiding anything. How did she enter the Viper Cross? How did she come to Hollier City? Why did she want to leave the church? Akasha had no intention of hiding anything at all. She told him everything. These things had been suppressed in her heart for too long. To a large extent, Akasha's depression and fear were caused by the accumulation of negative emotions. And Roddy's question just happened to open her mouth, allowing her accumulated pain, depression, and sadness to finally find a way to vent. With Akasha's narration, Roddy finally understood that the secret passage in Hollier City was created by the Viper Cross, and her appearance in the ancient records room was because of the Snake King Sakya. Roddy listened quietly. Although he had never studied psychology, he was used to analyzing and solving problems rationally. Obviously, what Akasha lacked the most now was a sense of security, and what he needed was her healing magic. If that was the case, his eyes suddenly lit up, and he suddenly thought of an almost forgotten method. After Akasha finished narrating her experience, the accumulated negative emotions were cleared. She found that her fear seemed to have lessened a lot, and her originally blank mind slowly recovered its ability to think. She rubbed her red and swollen eyes and said in a low voice, I feel better." Roddy did not expect that he had accidentally made Akasha's mental illness feel better, but he had to press on. He thought for a moment and said his solution, "Your experience is very complicated, so I can give you two choices now. One, like the two mercenaries, accept my employment for 3 months, and I will sign a contract to ensure the validity of the contract. Or you can choose to follow me. My subordinates have territories in the kingdom, and you can have a new, legal identity. At the same time, you will no longer have to worry about the church's revenge on you. Give me an answer when you have thought about it. Roddy's words could be said to be to the point, because a new identity and the guarantee of personal safety was what Akasha needed at the moment. So she immediately replied excitedly, I choose to follow you. After saying this, Akasha found that she actually exhaled involuntarily, and her body was suddenly filled with an inexplicable power. Roddy did not know that his decision had completely changed Akasha. At this time, he was looking at the interface in front of him with a perturbed mood, and after seeing the dialogue box that popped up, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Do you want to accept Akasha as your follower? Without hesitation, Roddy chose accept. Follower contract. This was the method that Roddy had just thought of. This was a contractual connection that the players had long ignored, but it immediately solved the problem that both of them were vexed about. Akasha was forced by the system to become a comrade who could not threaten Roddy, and Roddy provided her with protection, solving the problem. The effect of this contract was very straightforward. Roddy would keep 95% of the experience he gained in the future, and the remaining 5% would be given to Akasha as a reward, and Akasha was obliged to unconditionally assist Roddy in battle. Previously, his relationship with Sodeler and the others was built on the basis of being subordinates in the military system. After that, they became comrades who had killed their way out of a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood together. It had long been abnormally stable, so Roddy had completely forgotten that there was such a contract in the game that could bind NPCs. In the game, follower could only be between NPCs and players, but players generally had no interest in NPCs who could not be resurrected, so the follower contract had always been unpopular and almost forgotten. But at this time, such an unpopular contract had immediately become a control method. With the restriction of the contract, Akasha had to assist Roddy in battle, and he only needed to lose 5% of his experience in exchange for a healer who would not betray him. This was definitely a good deal for Roddy, who could not afford to die. He was in a good mood. Seeing that Akasha was still sitting, he said, Are you feeling better now? Then go back and rest early. Akasha was trying hard to adapt to her new role. Although her mental state had improved a lot, her fear of the dark did not immediately disappear. She looked at Roddy's ring, wanting to say something but hesitated. Finally, she whispered, Can you keep it lit? I'm still a little afraid of the dark. Roddy raised his eyebrows, then happily reached out to take off the ring and directly placed it on Akasha's palm. In the future, you can take it. If you're afraid of the dark, just light it. With the contract, Roddy was not afraid that Akasha would run away with the ring. He did this because he trusted the contract, and not because he trusted Akasha. However, Akasha did not see it that way. She held the warm ring and was instantly moved to the point that she did not know what to say. With tears in her eyes, she put it on her hand. Roddy did not realize the crux of the matter. After sending her to her original tent, he went back to rest. But Akasha, who was lying on the simple bed, did not sleep for half the night. She just stared blankly at the ring that dispelled the darkness and fear. She whispered to herself, Is this the feeling of being trusted? She sighed softly. For many years, Akasha had never been as calm and satisfied as she was at this moment. Elon Calendar, Year 588, October 23rd. Under the gloomy sky, Gig Town outside the Forest of Silence gradually became deserted. There was no longer the bustling hawkers in the cold air. Even during the day, the streets seemed empty. Only a few big shops, such as the Mercenary Guild and the herb shop in the central area, were still open, but they were deserted and had few customers. For humans in this era, when the cold winter arrived, all activities outside would be avoided as much as possible. Not to mention that Gig Town's taxes this year were much heavier than in the past, so the income-strapped residents did not have the leisure to carry out other trades. Where there was poverty there was wealth. In this era where the gap between the rich and the poor was extreme, no matter how many homeless beggars froze to death on the streets, the nobles would still sit in front of the warm fireplace and enjoy exquisite food as if nothing had happened. As the owner of Gigtown, Viscount Tranca was the same. In the master bedroom of the Ford Manor, the Viscount was choosing clothes for the banquet under the service of a maid. Tall and handsome, he could be considered a famous romantic figure in the Efta territory. At this moment, the Viscount was thinking about which noble lady he should invite to the banquet tonight to spend the night with. His gaze was quite contented as he looked at the fit and beautiful figure in the full-length mirror. The narcissistic Viscount was about to ask the maid to bring another set of clothes, but when he turned around, he found that the two maids had already fallen to the ground, completely unconscious. Who? He turned around and found a figure in a black robe standing silently behind him. On the other party's old and ugly face, a pair of cold grey eyes stared straight at him indifferently. Lord Ansedin. In the next moment, Viscount Tranca knelt down on one knee and called out the name of the necromancer in front of him. Obviously, this Viscount in the Efta territory had long become the most obedient lackey under Ansedin. I received your reply. Well done. Now that the resources collected are enough, the next stage of preparation can already begin. Ansedin's words made Tranca a little excited. He hurriedly replied, For His Majesty Augustine, it's worth doing more. In order to raise funds for Ansedin, Tranca raised the various taxes this year by a full 40%, causing complaints in the territory. However, it was obvious that the lives of the civilians were insignificant compared to his great goal. Tranca was one of the puppets created by the soul extraction potion. Although it was a puppet, it still retained its original consciousness and behavior. Before encountering the puppet lord, it behaved no different from a normal person. In addition, Ansedin usually did not let him come into contact with the intelligence network of the undead. Therefore, such a puppet was completely untraceable and had no flaws. I have something to say. Ansedin's voice was low and cold. The experiment will be postponed for the time being. Give me the information of the Lord of Par. Chapter 192. Ansedin's words were an order. Viscount Tranca didn't dare to have any objections and immediately nodded in agreement. After arranging this task, Ansedin didn't leave immediately. He asked another question. Is the purchase of medicinal herbs going well? Sir, the herb shop in Gigtown is completely under your control. Once there are herbs that meet the standard, they will be purchased immediately. Tranca thought for a moment and continued. Several elders of the Pharmacist Association have highly praised the formula you left last time. For this, they have increased their income and have been converted into funds. Although he was a puppet, Tranca still had his own thinking ability. His ability to flatter was very good. While answering the question, he also flattered Ansedin's ability to make potions. Although he was in a high position, Ansedin didn't spend much time in politics after all. This kind of flattery did make him very comfortable. But he was proud in his heart. But he said, the level of pharmacists in the kingdom of Karen is really not worth mentioning. It's really disappointing. Then he changed the topic. Has there been any cases of people going missing in the village? Tranca was a little stunned by this question. He thought that most of the people going missing were because you asked me to do it. What do you mean by this question? But then he saw that Ansedin was very serious. After thinking for a moment, he replied, It's almost winter. There are only a few mercenary groups that went out in the village. They may not have returned yet. I haven't heard of any other cases of people going missing. Ansedin was silent. He asked this naturally. In fact, he wanted to see if Magda did anything here. That arrogant old man was powerful and did things without scruples. If he started a massacre here, he would be happy instead. Because he could use this opportunity to report to His Majesty Augustine and push all the blame on him. but since Magda chose to hide, he had other ways to deal with it. After thinking about this, he gave a few words to Tranka and directly jumped on the back of the gargoyle from the window and disappeared into the jungle in an instant. Ansadin didn't immediately look for Magda. Instead, he came to an uninhabited manor outside of Gigtown and went directly to the underground tomb behind the house. The underground tomb with 3 floors was much larger than the outside house. Rows of wooden shelves were mostly filled with all kinds of potions and materials. This was Ansadin's laboratory. It was also the base where he refined medicinal materials, made undead sculptures, and dealt with affairs. According to the original plan, Ansadin was supposed to stay in the Lars mountain range until mid-November. His only purpose there was to find enough frost breath grass to make more powerful puppets. But now he suddenly turned back, naturally, to get rid of some troubles. In Ansadin's eyes, Rodi, Rubens, and even Duke of Angmar were not troubles. What he was worried about were the 2 characters, Magda and His Majesty Augustine. Humans? This lowly race did not have the qualifications to make him worry. In Ansadin's judgment, Magda's failure was attributed to being ambushed. What he needed to do now was to catch her off guard and quickly kill that guy named Roddy, then go to Hollier City to settle the score. Ansadin had no interest in fighting a common enemy with Magda. He naturally did this for himself, to kill Roddy before Magda recovered, then write a letter to King Augustine explaining the pros and cons, and tell him about the failure of the Blighters. This way, His Majesty would naturally think that he was strong and the Blighters were a pile of trash. If he delayed Magda's recovery time, that old thing would probably be grateful to him. Harming others to benefit oneself? Ansadin was a politician. As long as it was ultimately benefiting himself, he would not care if it was a person who was being harmed. Stepping in front of the desk, Ansadin's elder wand lightly tapped on the front of a tightened metal cabinet. After the heavy cabinet door opened, it revealed a densely packed pile of miniature puppet sculptures. For a puppet necromancer, it was really not his turn to personally deal with a few trash in the human territory. TSK, using these to deal with the humans is really grand. At the same time, Roddy and the others who left Elsa village also walked to the edge of the Forest of Silence. Looking at the town of Kig that was dozens of miles away, Roddy chose to bring Natha and Akasha to part ways with Buffon and Henry. Roddy arranged a lot of tasks for the 2 mercenaries in the town of Kig, while he prepared to go to Pear territory and meet up with Sodeler and the others to plan how to deal with Magda. This situation was a little strange. Just by signing a contract of employment, Roddy had so much trust in Henry and Buffon. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed that he was a little too naive. After all, Buffon and Henry were carrying a whole bag of rare herbs and a few bags of wine that were destined to be expensive. If the 2 of them had any ulterior motives, they could just sell the goods and get a few years' worth of remuneration. But Roddy did not seem to care at all. He only called out to the 2 mercenaries before they left, and whispered a few promises to them. Then he said loudly, "I'll be waiting for your good news." After that, he took Natha and Akasha in another direction. The 2 mercenaries looked at his back in a daze. Buffon was an honest man. He tightened his bag and walked towards the town of Kig. Henry, who was next to him, squinted his eyes and thought for a long time, but he felt that he could not understand Roddy. "Buffon, what do you think of him?" Buffon, Aldo, answered with a dull expression, "He sees further than us." "I don't think so. He has strength and courage, but he seems to take everything for granted." Henry shook his head. He naturally did not expect the simple-minded Buffon to say anything reasonable. He stretched out his hand and weighed the large bag of herbs on his back. His respectful and obedient attitude in front of Rhodey immediately changed. He swaggered towards Kygertown. "Forget it. In any case, he saved our lives. Let's just do what we need to do." As for the rest, let's not meddle in other people's business. Buffon nodded. After all, a mission was a mission. Roddy did not ask them to work too hard. The right thing to do after returning to the town was to have a good meal and rest first. But he was simple and honest, and he added, "Let's hurry up. I feel that he seems to have other reasons for not going to the town of Kig." Fatty raised his eyebrows. He also vaguely felt it, but he could not find the basis. After thinking for a long time, he decided not to think about it anymore. Being a mercenary was to earn money and live a day. There was no need to think so much. On the other side, Roddy, who was walking in the opposite direction, seemed to have a lot of luck with women. Natha was wearing the strange animal skin clothes from before. But in order to hide her identity as a wood elf, Roddy specially made her wear his own hooded cloak. Her delicate face was covered with a piece of black cloth, revealing only a pair of eyes. When an ordinary person saw her, they would not even think of her identity as a wood elf. Roddy and Akasha also put on cloaks to keep warm. Such a combination of 2 women and 1 man was really rare. But Roddy did not have the thought of showing off at all. He was thinking about many things at this time. How was the construction of Par? How was the progress of Sodeler and the others? Did Wellington teach him martial arts properly? Would Magda take revenge in advance? How would that Ansadin react? He felt a little uneasy, so he walked faster. He only wanted to return as soon as possible so that he could deal with the trouble brought by Magda. Behind him, Natha, who had walked out of the forest for the first time, felt a little strange. Along the way, Natha had actually been thinking about whether she had made the right choice this time. For a wood elf who had never seen the human world, leaving the forest was like a baby leaving her mother's embrace. She could not help but feel nervous and uneasy. But she would not show this kind of emotion to anyone. She continued to walk in silence as usual. Roddy was busy thinking about his own matters and did not think about this either. He only minded his own business and walked in front. Occasionally, he would find a hillside to identify the scenery and direction, and then he would continue to walk in silence. Among the 3 of them, the only one who was in a good mood was Akasha. After experiencing what happened last night, her original psychological pressure had almost completely disappeared. She was no longer trembling with anxiety as she followed behind Roddy. Even her pale face had a little more color. Rubbing the warm ring on her finger, the corner of Akasha's mouth slightly curled up. She seemed to be very relaxed. She did not know why, but after wearing the ring, she could clearly feel that her body was improving faster. Even the effect of the punishment of whipping curse had weakened a lot. She did not know if it was because of the weakening of the curse or something else. In short, everything was developing in a good direction, and that was enough. When they camped at night, although there were only 3 people in front of the campfire, Akasha still felt that everything was so beautiful. Eating the fragrant roasted meat and drinking the fragrant wine, Akasha sighed for the first time that there could be such a pleasant moment in life. She stared at the fire, lost in thought as she recalled the sad times in the past. She drank mouthful after mouthful of wine. At the side, Natha spoke to Roddy for the first time that day. "When will you start teaching me archery?" This was the only reason why she followed Roddy out of the forest. Natha was simple-minded and naturally would not consider other things. Previously, Roddy had also thought about how to teach this teacher of his. But after thinking about it, the way she taught him was very simple. It was simply to issue a mission. No matter how many times he died, he would be qualified if he could complete the mission. But this method was not suitable for Natha. After all, if anything went wrong, this talented wood elf would only end up dead. So after thinking for a long time, Roddy could only start from the basics. "We will reach Payer territory tomorrow. I originally wanted to teach you archery by then, but since you asked, I will have a chat with you." When the topic of the field of archery was mentioned, Roddy immediately became a little more confident. This was the pride and confidence that he had cultivated by standing at the peak of the field for a long time. Roddy had really put in a lot of effort in archery, and there were no tricks involved. Hearing this, Natha immediately put on an attentive posture. Obviously, she really wanted to learn. Akasha did not understand what they were talking about and looked over curiously. Of course, her eyes were mainly focused on Roddy. Let's start from the most basic things. Do you understand your bow? Roddy's question surprised Natha. She reached for her short bow and nodded. I understand it better than anyone else. Then are you sure it is in the best condition? Yes. Alright, give it to me. Chapter 193. Natha's only reaction to Roddy's words was astonishment. As a weapon that she had used for 3 years, Natha was already very familiar with this short bow. After 3 years of hunting, Natha had long adjusted the attributes of this short bow to its optimal state. She had already memorized the position of each arrow when it was shot, so she couldn't believe Roddy's words at all. However, for Roddy, who had once reached the Grandmaster level in bow-making, he could basically tell whether a bow was good or not without shooting it. The structure of the bow seemed simple, but the simpler it was, the more difficult it was to adjust it to its optimal state. Although the Wood Elves were good at using bows, their level of technology couldn't compare to the High Elves. Even though the bow had a rough bow window, the craftsmanship of the Wood Elves still couldn't compare to that of the humans. Natha's short bow was strong and had a high initial speed. However, its weakness was that it had a low tolerance for mistakes. If there was a slight mistake in the fingers, the arrow would greatly deviate from the original target. It was only suitable for experienced hunters to use it. Generally speaking, the longer the bow, the lower the initial speed, the higher the tolerance for mistakes, and the more stable the trajectory of a heavy arrow would be. The famous English longbow in history was the extreme of the stable type. Every type of bow had its own characteristic. Natha's short bow was small and nimble, and it was easy to shoot at close range. However, in Roddy's eyes, it was still a distance from its optimal state. Natha looked at Roddy in disbelief. Roddy didn't waste any time. He immediately removed the bowstring and adjusted the short bow under the light of the bonfire. He took out the tools he carried with him from his bag, and without waiting for Natha's consent, he immediately started polishing the bow window. The wood of this bow is good, but the craftsmanship is rather crude. You could even say that it's crude. Roddy lowered his head and evaluated the bow as he lowered his head. The curve of the bow is too extreme, and it focuses too much on the speed of the arrow. Naturally, the accuracy will be poor the first year you use it. I think you'll need 2 or 3 years to get used to it. This was a very professional evaluation, just like how an old blacksmith would evaluate a newbie's weapon. Roddy definitely had the right to make such an evaluation. However, as soon as he finished speaking, Natha's expression changed again. Finally, she blushed and lowered her head. She had made this bow herself. Although she admired Roddy's ability, Natha didn't expect him to be so proficient with the bow. His evaluation was very impressive, and could even be said to be flawless. At first, she thought that Roddy was just pretending to nitpick. However, she did not dare to say anything now. She lowered her head and stood there silently like a child being scolded. This can't be said to be a weakness. Every bow has its own characteristic. Fast bows have their own advantages, and slow bows have their own advantages. A weapon is just a weapon. It depends on who is using it. Roddy raised his head and looked at Natha, who was at a loss. He smiled and then blew off the debris left on the bow window. He took out a piece of fur the size of a finger from his bag and nailed it with a special iron nail. It was made into an arrow platform made of animal fur, similar to the hunting bows of the later generations. Water lazy fur is better than horse but fur, Roddy explained, but Natha didn't know what it was used for. The elves didn't use such an arrow platform at all, so she could only nod. But in her heart, she kept reminding herself to seize the opportunity to remember everything in front of her. After adjusting the bow window, Roddy slightly polished the edge of the bow, then put the bowstring on and adjusted the bow. He was quiet and focused during the process. Natha held her breath and waited, but she felt that Roddy's deep gaze filled her heart with a sense of security. 20 minutes later, Roddy finished adjusting the bow. He then asked Natha to knock an arrow and try it. But he didn't let her shoot the arrow. Instead, he picked up the arrow and looked at it. He directly removed the arrowhead, shortened the arrow by a centimeter, and put the arrowhead back. He then pointed to a tree not far away and said, "There's a lizard up there. Try shooting it." Natha took the bow hesitantly and immediately shot the arrow. Whoosh! The moment the arrow left the bow, Natha's expression suddenly froze. In the past, the uncontrollable trembling and slight pulsation of the arrow had always been her greatest headache when shooting. However, when this arrow flew out, she only felt the short bow in her left hand shake slightly, and then the arrow spun in a perfectly straight line as it shot out. Refreshing, unprecedentedly refreshing. There was no need to resist the tremor of the bow, no need to correct the distortion of the arrow. All the obstacles were almost completely gone. Tut! The arrow hit the tree trunk, but the arrowhead was nailed to the top of the lizard. Due to the increased efficiency of the bow, the arrow's landing point had also changed. The arrow missed and was completely within Roddy's expectations. The arrow nest still needs to be adjusted, but it's almost there. Roddy recalled the arrow's trajectory, still not satisfied. Next to him, Natha stared blankly at the arrow nailed to the tree trunk in the distance, her mind blank. She stood there for a full 3 to 5 seconds, and finally said to herself, "Why? Why is it like this?" Following Roddy out of the forest, Natha wanted to learn archery from Roddy. As for other aspects, she did not think that this human had the qualifications to teach her. But the reality mercilessly shattered her pride, and Natha had no choice but to bow her head. Can you tell me how you did it?" Natha's calm voice finally had a little ripple. Her expression even surprised Roddy a little. In his memory, Roddy had never seen this iceberg teacher ask for advice like this. But he would not hide anything, and directly began to explain to her the function of the bow itself. Ordinary people would naturally think that the bow was too simple, just pull and release the arrow, and that was it. Who would have thought that in order to use a bow to its fullest potential, there was a lot more to it. The moment the arrow is shot, it is curved, so its length, material, and center of gravity will affect the landing point and flying speed. Your pull determines the length of the arrow, and the pull of the bow determines the angle of the arrow. Oh, it is the degree of softness and hardness. This kind of explanation did not say too much. Roddy knew that she needed time to digest, but it was obvious that this arrogant elf girl was completely subdued by these systematic and detailed theories. Although her expression was still cold, there was an invisible sense of respect. Roddy sighed in his heart. He really did not expect that there would be a day when the teacher would listen to him so obediently. As the night gradually deepened, Natha and Akasha returned to the tent to rest. Roddy sat in front of the campfire to keep watch. From this angle, he could still see the faint light in Akasha's tent. She must have let the ring shine because she was afraid of the dark. But obviously, she was finally no longer pestering him and could sleep alone. The debuff on her body was gradually subsiding, and it seemed that she would fully recover after a period of time. Looking at the orange charcoal, Roddy thought for a moment and took out 2 books. One was the notebook left behind by the Witcher Dukel, and the other was The Essence of Energy that he borrowed from Brody. Flipping open the notebook, the high elf language was a little messy, but from the format, he could tell that it was a diary. Roddy frowned and skimmed through the first entry. The content mainly talked about Dukel's experience of taming the Snake King Sakya. There was no other important information, so he put down the notebook and flipped to The Essence of Energy, and the first sentence at the beginning made him freeze on the spot. Arcane magic, the power that surpasses the gods. It was an affirmative sentence, not a question. Roddy could even see the arrogance in the flowing high elf language. The next day, Parl territory. The territory that the Dukes of Angmar had given to Sodalar was not big. In terms of area, it could not compare to the great nobles like Viscount Tranca or Count Tata. But as a baron, with a town and 9 villages, Parl territory was definitely above average in terms of resources. Parl town was a small town near a river. It could not compare to the size of Kyger town. The residents lived in peace for many years, paying taxes and farming. A few large shops supported the town's facade. In terms of economic level, it was many times better than Norland village. As the weather gradually turned cold, there were fewer people in the morning. But in the heart of the territory, Parl town, the residents were already used to the orderly footsteps and chants every morning. Almost 100 soldiers would wear their armor and run 3 rounds around the town. When the sun was completely up, they would go to the drill ground and start their daily training. This was unheard of in the past. In this day and age, other than the great lords and the royal family, the other nobles did not have a standing army, let alone a cavalry that trained day and night. So at first, all the commoners were anxious. Was the kingdom going to war? But after a month, the information they gathered told them that the kingdom of Karen was still peaceful. There were no signs of war. So the new Lord Sodalar became a joke. He was even privately called a war maniac and madman by the farmers. Those madmen have started training again. Seems like the Lord is running with them again. What a joke. I heard that they were just a group of border scouts before. Maybe they were scared by the horses and dare not relax even now. Who knows? Rushing around every day, your aura is quite frightening. What era is it? There's no war. The commoners did not understand the strange way the Lord behaved. Similar comments had been going on for more than a month. But no matter what they said, the new Lord did not give any explanation. He just assigned the territory's affairs to the new butler and then spent all day in the drill ground to participate in training. He did not look like he was enjoying life at all. In fact, he seemed to be working harder than the ordinary soldiers. Chapter 194. Attention! Count off. After the morning run, the 2 captains, Ruger and Carter, would bring the scout team to the town square to line up. After that, the team would disperse for lunch. After lunch, a whole day of training would begin. Some were strengthening, some were battle swordsmanship, some were cavalry battles, and there were even small team combat drills. The team had been following Roddy's training plan without any mistake. The new Knights Templar did not participate in the training. Roddy's only request for them was to observe all the scout training courses. This made them feel relieved. After all, the training of the scouts was inhuman. Just thinking about it gave them a headache. In the eyes of ordinary people, what was the use of running laps? What was the use of hugging a rock to train? It was better to practice swordsmanship. Naturally, they had a disdainful and mocking attitude. Most of the Knights Templar felt that this group of scouts running around all day was comical, like a group of monkeys. But as a Knight Wellington who had experienced war, he did not come to a conclusion so easily. The training that Roddy arranged for them seems to be very complicated. On the morning of the 24th of October, Wellington looked at the scouts in the distance who were cooperating with each other. His eyebrows furrowed even deeper than a few days ago. There is a procedure. It is probably done according to a certain pace. There are a lot of aspects involved, but it should not be complicated. Sodalar was wearing a simple combat shirt, leather boots, and a long sword hung on his belt. There was still sweat on his forehead. He had the habit of running with the soldiers. I have never seen this kind of training. But if they really go on the battlefield, their combat power will definitely be much stronger than the other troop. It was not easy for the Knight of Wellington to praise them. He could feel the smell of blood on the scouts. This was definitely not something that the ordinary army of the kingdom could have. In this day and age, the so-called army was mostly a group of farmers who picked up weapons. Even the professional mercenaries were mostly used to being undisciplined. They were valiant but lacked discipline. They were completely different from the professional soldiers in front of him. Sodeler took out a small book and flipped through the next part of the plan. He explained bluntly, Rhodey's goal is very simple. He needs an elite army capable of resolving small-scale conflict. Wellington was silent. After all, he was considered an outsider, and was not willing to ask too much about the private affairs of the territory. Seeing this, Sodeler no longer chit-chat. He bowed and said, Then let's begin today's lecture, Knight Wellington. With the Dukes of Angmar's request, Wellington naturally had to accept Sodeler as his disciple. He was also quite satisfied with Sodeler's superb comprehension and talent. He taught him swordsmanship, key points of battle, how to condense battle aura, and so on. Sodeler naturally benefited greatly from his teachings. It could be said that Sodeler had improved by leaps and bounds over the past month. But just as the two were about to begin today's practice, the soldiers running from afar brought news that they had been waiting for a long time. Roddy had returned. Sodeler and Knight Wellington immediately went to greet him. But when they saw the two people following behind Roddy, their expressions instantly became extremely strange. Didn't he say he was going to the Silent Forest? Why did he bring two people back? Both of them knew that Sally had feelings for Roddy. So when they saw that Roddy seemed to have good luck with women, their expressions became a little strange. Knight Wellington, Sir Baron. Roddy smiled and saluted to the two. Immediately, the original strange atmosphere disappeared. Wellington grinned, but Sodeler directly punched Roddy's chest and jokingly scolded, "You're teasing me on purpose, aren't you?" The friendship between men was always expressed in this way. Although they had only not seen each other for a month, they could see some changes in each other. Knight Wellington even slightly narrowed his eyes and gently sniffed, as if he could smell the increasingly strong smell of blood on Roddy's body. The others naturally could not capture such details. Sodeler and Roddy exchanged a few words, and then looked behind Roddy in confusion. Natha's indifferent eyes were looking at the surrounding buildings. Although no emotions could be seen, the curiosity in her eyes could not be concealed. Naturally, Akasha was not like Nada. She was actually looking at Sodeler curiously. That was because in her memory, Sodeler, who Roddy called Baron, was one of the scouts who fought together with Roddy in the Orc Kingdom. She was a little puzzled. Why did Roddy's subordinate become a noble lord, but he was still alone? Let me briefly introduce you. This is Akasha, a holy priest. She hopes to have a suitable identity here. Sir Lord, do as you see fit. Roddy winked at Sodeler. The latter covered his forehead and made a helpless expression. Then, he formally bowed to Akasha and said, "Welcome to Par territory. I can do whatever Roddy promises." Having been away from battle for a month, Sodeler's tone was no longer as solemn and tense as before. He said in a relaxed tone, "Actually, you can treat him as a lord. Don't look at me, he has the final say here." After saying that, he winked at Roddy, obviously wanting to make this captain proud in front of the two ladies. But before Roddy could say anything, a scout ran over from behind. Obviously, he had news to report. "Captain Roddy, Sir Lord, Knight Wellington." He had a respectful expression on his face. From the order in which he called them, it was obvious who these people in front of him were. Sodeler should have been the one to respond, but he looked directly at Roddy. This attitude obviously made Roddy feel a little helpless. He emphasized, "You are the Lord, don't look at me." Wellington, who was at the side, smiled. He was really curious about the relationship between these two people. Sodeler did not feel awkward. He smiled and turned his head to ask, "Where did you get the news?" Viscount Tranka sent a team, led by Butler Blake of Gigtown. He said that he was busy some time ago, and now he finally took the time to send a batch of supplies as a congratulatory gift. Viscount Tranka? He really is considerate. Where is he? They have arrived outside Par Town. The caravan has stopped at the town entrance, Sir Lord. The scout's answer made Sodeler take it seriously. Obviously, as the new lord, it was necessary to have a good relationship with the neighbors. Viscount Tranka's territory was adjacent to Par Town. The Viscount's territory was not small, and his territory was rich in resources and had a large population. No matter what, he was a person worth paying attention to. This is good. You go and entertain them first. I will settle them down. When there is time, I will introduce you to them. Roddy did not have any intention of interfering with the order. He really did hope that Sodeler could build this place well. Of course, the ultimate goal was naturally to better support his future territory. Wellington did not participate in the discussion. He chose to avoid arousing suspicion and said, "I will go and take a look at the training of those boys. You go ahead." Sodeler bowed respectfully to Wellington. He considered himself a disciple, and his attitude was always humble. He turned around and smiled apologetically at Roddy and the two beauties behind him. He said, "Ruger has nothing to do this morning. He should be in the town's blacksmith shop studying weapons. Go and find him to arrange food and lodging. By the way, the egg you placed in Noran village has hatched. When you have time, go and take a look. It's a little turtle." Roddy's eyes brightened. He nodded to show that he understood. Then, without saying anything more, they turned around and did their own things. Both of them were quick-witted people. Even though their status had changed, they were still as swift and decisive as before. "I really did not expect that he has already become a lord," Akasha sighed. Akasha sighed, but there was not much emotion in her words. She had always been a person who was at ease with the circumstances. After her worries were gradually dispelled, she became more and more quiet. She did not have too many desires. She only wanted to live happily every day. "There are many things that you did not expect. This won't make a difference. I will find a suitable place for you to stay. Take care of your body first." Roddy then turned around and asked Natha, "Just now, those two people, who do you think is stronger?" Natha was stunned for a moment. Then, she realized that Roddy was testing her. She thought for a moment and said, "The taller one looks very dangerous. The shorter one is also a bit difficult to deal with." Knight Wellington was 2 meters tall. Sodeler was slightly shorter. Obviously, Natha's judgment was very accurate. Roddy nodded and said, "There are many things to learn here. The first is observation." He then pointed to the town and said, "From now on, I will not restrict your movements. Before dark, you have to figure out the terrain here. You have to familiarize yourself with this place like you are familiar with the jungle. In the evening, when it's time for dinner, come and find me." Natha nodded and then walked to the side without hesitation. "She doesn't like to talk," Akasha said as she looked at Natha's back. Her coldness was slightly piercing. Although she knew that she had helped her before, Akasha could not communicate with her at all. The language barrier was secondary. Natha's cold eyes really made people feel uncomfortable. Natha has that kind of personality. Don't worry about her. Roddy looked at Butler Blake in the distance. Suddenly, his expression became a little solemn. However, this emotion was fleeting, and Akasha did not notice it. "There will definitely be a banquet tonight. If you can, come along." Okay. Akasha's heart moved slightly. She did not quite understand the intention of Roddy's arrangement. She looked at the figure in front of her who was greeting the scout. Her fingertips could not help but fiddle with the ring. There was an inexplicable feeling of honor in her heart. Chapter 195. In the underground tomb of Gigtown, Viscount Tranca was kneeling on one knee, reporting the information he had found in a low voice. Sir Ansedin, the subsequent batches of information have been verified. It is confirmed that the only threatening target in Par territory is that Knight Wellington. The rest is not a concern. A bunch of scattered soldiers and dozens of pampered Templars. Of course, I won't take them seriously. Ansedin's dry finger tapped on the parchment beside the table and said, Blake will solve all the problems at night, but I have a question. Why can't we find the whereabouts of that Roddy? Sir, he seems to have refused the title of Baron and chose to go alone. Ridiculous. Ansedin snorted coldly. He had seen the greed of humans. He did not believe that anyone could refuse the temptation of glory and wealth. But what the scout captain thought was no longer important. The puppets that arrived with Blake in Par territory would naturally deal with these bastards. Tranca was afraid that things would change, and added, Sir, that Knight Wellington is not weak. He can even be called one of the 2 strongest knights in EFTA. Ha! Ansedin smiled disdainfully, turned his head to look at the magic circle that represented all the puppets, and said coldly, What strongest? In front of the powerful puppets they are all weaklings. In front of him, the magic circle with blue light flashed with 13 nodes, representing the 13 puppets he sent out this time. These were not the skeleton soldiers that ordinary people thought could be smashed with a club. Skeleton soldiers belonged to the necromancy summoning system, and the strength of the puppet system was that the summoned puppets were not completely controlled by the necromancer. Instead, they had their own battle consciousness according to the materials they were made of, and the more precious the materials, the more powerful they were. Over the years, Viscount Tranca had accumulated a great deal of wealth for Ansedin, and at the same time exchanged it for countless materials that were enough to summon powerful puppets. Therefore, the puppets preparing to attack at this time were far stronger than those of the same level. Ansedin glanced at the magic circle. The magic crystal in the center was steadily supplying energy. Puppet didn't require a necromancer to have a high spiritual requirement. The only drawback was that it consumed a lot of energy. But Tycoon Ansedin really didn't lack money. After letting Taranka leave, Ansedin was ready to rummage through some formulas, because Taranka had just brought a piece of news. A lot of precious herbs had suddenly appeared in the trading market of Gigtown. However, it seemed that the owner of the medicinal ingredients did not intend to sell them directly. Instead, he wanted to pay for the labor fee and directly take the finished product. He even offered to provide half of the medicinal ingredients for the potion. This made Ansedin, who valued a few of the medicinal ingredients, quite concerned. Needless to say, Taranka had already started to buy them. Flipping through the old book, a black crow with scarlet eyes cawed twice outside the entrance of the underground tomb. Ansedin turned his head, and a strange smile appeared on his rotten face. TSK, Senior Magda seems to be very pitiful. After saying that, he stepped out, raised his hand and let the black crow fly to his shoulder, and walked towards the place where Magda was hiding outside Gigtown, ******* in the evening, Payer Town. After the chief butler of Viscount Tranca, Blake, arrived here, the atmosphere in the town was much livelier than before. The commoners looked at the carriages parked outside the town with envious looks on their faces. Although the new lord was always silly, his heart was still good. A few days ago, when the temperature dropped, he actually sent people to distribute a lot of bread to the beggars. Obviously, this kind of behavior left a good impression on the commoners. So seeing that the lord had an income, the civilians naturally wondered if the lord was going to give them some benefits or something. But what surprised them was that the scouts who were training on the drill ground were all gone. Those who came out to greet them were the holy knights who used to live like princes. These armed forces that belonged to the church were well equipped and looked good. When Butler Blake saw them, he sincerely admired them and praised them for their bravery, which made the holy knights feel so proud that they almost wanted to fly to the sky. The group of knights had the same thought at this time. The group of scouts worked themselves to death, and when it was time to show their faces, they did not even have the qualifications to show their faces. So damn sad. The surrounding civilians also had similar comments about this. Why didn't the group of lads come out? Could it be that they have stage fright? It must be that the Lord thinks that they don't look good, and is afraid that the butler will look down on them. That's right, those guys are like mud monkeys every day. It's really not right to pull them out to stand here. These words made the Templar Knights and the guards feel even more proud. After all, they had never participated in a battle. They were only selected strong men. Their swordsmanship and horsemanship were good enough. Who would want to risk their lives in a battle? But along the way, Sodeler frowned slightly. He was very clear that the scouts would not stop training just because of the arrival of a big shot, even if the Dukes of Angmar came. The only one who had the authority to order them was Roddy, who had just returned. Could it be that there was an accident? Sodeler was a steady and cautious person. He could think of such details while chatting with Blake. If it were anyone else, they would not be able to do it. But along the way, he did not see Roddy at all. He only saw Wellington in front of the Baron's mansion as if nothing had happened. The dinner has been prepared. Butler Blake just needs to rest here for a while. Sodeler was born into a noble family. Naturally, he knew the habit of flattering each other. Viscount Tranca's status was not low, so Sodeler gave him enough face. Blake touched his goatee and looked pleased. He also threw out a lot of flattery and then walked into the Baron's mansion with the two guards. Wellington stood silently at the side. The characteristics of a ghost knight made him seem invisible. But when he looked at the two guards, his eyes flickered slightly. When he turned around, he found Roddy's figure in the crowd not far away. Interesting. Wellington was not young, and he had a more thorough understanding of the affairs of the nobles. But in his opinion, this Blake did not have much purpose. At most, he came with a stick and a carrot to dampen Sodeler's spirit. After all, as the new lord, Sodeler was too young. He had no foundation and no experience. It was normal for an old noble to come and bully him. With this in mind, Knight Wellington did not take Blake seriously. After all, with his status, he could face Viscount Tranca without any pressure. He turned his head and was thinking about the consequences of the scouts' training. But suddenly, he looked up and felt a shadow flashing in the distance. Looking carefully, he found a delicate figure in a cloak standing on the roof of a tailor's shop looking around. The tailor downstairs was shouting at her, but the veiled woman did not care at all. She just glanced at him indifferently, turned around and jumped over another wall. Although she was agile, Wellington shook his head and left with a sigh. Where did this kid find such a lunatic? Roddy, who was ridiculed by the ghost knight, was not relaxed at this time. Although he was a little nervous after seeing the butler Blake, he instinctively raised his guard. Roddy was very clear that the biggest difference between him and others was that he could see the system interface. The existence of the surrounding character's status bar had helped him avoid many disasters, and now the bright red font of Blake and the guards made Roddy have to make various plans. He was not sure if the other party was hostile, but there had to be a reason for the abnormality. It was not a bad thing to be cautious. Therefore, within half an hour, he had ordered all the scouts to enter the state of level 1 combat readiness. They had even put on metal armor and hid in several warehouses in the town. Even the war horses had been prepared. If something happened, they would directly attack. If nothing happened, it would be a drill. After doing this, Roddy also sent someone to inform Sodeler and Wellington, and even specifically asked someone to hide the weapons in the banquet hall. On the other hand, he asked the Holy Knights and Temple Guards to maintain their original appearance, so that they would not reveal any flaws. Ruger and Carter solemnly accepted the order to lead the team. Rhodey, on the other hand, seized the time to go to the room that Sodeler had already arranged for him. His belongings from Norland Village had already been moved over. In fact, there were not many old things. The room was very simple, the furniture was very new, and there was a basket next to the table. Roddy hurriedly walked over and confirmed that it was the egg that he had obtained in the Death Swamp. Of course, this time it was not an egg, but a snapping turtle. This snapping turtle was not much different from the wild snapping turtles that Roddy had seen on TV. It was also very small, not even half the size of a palm. There were some edges on its head, and the shape of its shell was sharper than that of tortoises, but that was all. A ranger could have a maximum of 4 pets. Usually, he could only bring one with him in battle, and the rest could be kept in the stable. It was the same for Witcher. Roddy thought for a while, then directly chose the taming skill from the skill bar and began to tame this snapping turtle. Although it was small, it was still a magical beast. Roddy did not expect this little turtle to bring any advantages in battle, but he valued the skills that it could add to his skills. The snapping turtle was stupid, and in addition to the cold weather, it was motionless like a stone. It did not resist at all as it accepted Roddy's taming. The process was surprisingly smooth. A faint light flashed, but Roddy suddenly groaned. A mysterious force crashed into his mind, making him feel as if he had been hit with a stick. But then this feeling gradually disappeared, and then it disappeared without a trace. That's it. Roddy looked at the snapping turtle that was looking up at him, and a frame appeared in front of him. Choose a pet name. Chapter 196. Rhodey rubbed his temples. The moment he completed the taming, his head would be impacted. This was something he did not expect. However, he quickly ignored the pain and turned his attention to the new skill that had just appeared. Although he had become a Witcher, Roddy did not intend to rely on his magic pet to fight. Adhering to his own style, Roddy only needed this additional skill. Turtle Shield Level 1 consumes 45 mana use, reduces all damage by 70%, lasts for 3 seconds. Cooldown time, 30 minutes. This skill was quite a surprise, but not a surprise. That was because Zarek, the snapping turtle from Death Swamp, had a similar skill, but its level was higher and its duration was longer. But now was not the time to think about the skill. He glanced at the description of Soul Link, confirmed that the range was limited to 2 kilometers, and breathed a sigh of relief. Then he stared blankly at the pet naming box for a while, looked down at the alligator snapping turtle that was not even the size of a palm, and said casually, "Seeing that you're so sturdy, I'll call you Nokia." The confused snapping turtle raised its head, completely not understanding the meaning of its name. But Roddy laughed after saying this. He was about to say something else when there was a knock on the door. Roddy turned around and saw that Akasha had changed into a formal dress and was standing at the door. Obviously, Ruger found this dress for her at the last minute. That guy could fight, but he was not good at picking clothes. This dress was obviously a little small, but it highlighted Akasha's voluptuous figure. For a moment, Roddy felt that she was comparable to the lingerie models of the top brand. "Are you ready?" But he had no interest in beauties at this time. He looked past Akasha and looked outside. Without waiting for her to reply, he said in a serious tone, "Don't let your guard down. We don't know if there will be a fight later. If there is an accident, find cover first and then help the healer, understand?" Akasha blinked her eyes. She did not understand what Roddy said at all. He was just talking about the dinner. Why did he say there would be a fight? But as a follower, she did not think of rejecting Roddy's order. But obviously, Akasha thought that he was just trying to scare her and did not take his words to heart. "Okay, no matter what, remember to protect yourself. Your survival is the most important thing, understand?" After saying this, Roddy pointed to Knight Wellington, who was striding away in the distance, and said, "Do me a favor and stop him. Tell him that I feel that the situation is not quite right and ask him not to go too far. I understand. Akasha nodded and left, but her footsteps were a little unsteady. Her head was dizzy, and her mind was not thinking about the crisis of the battle, but Roddy's words. Your survival is the most important, obviously. Akasha felt that Roddy's words seemed to have some other meaning. Naturally, she did not know that players valued healers the most in PvP. 99% of Roddy's attitude towards her was because of her holy priest identity, and basically had nothing to do with her. Looking at Akasha, who left, Roddy then made a stand-by gesture to the scout hiding in the corner not far away. When he was about to find Sodeler, he saw a paladin trotting over on horseback, and said loudly, "Sir Roddy, Butler Blake said that he wants to see you." Roddy frowned immediately. Viscount Tranka had nothing to do with him. Why did he call him by name? "Okay, I'll be right there." As Roddy said so, he suddenly felt something flashed past his vision. He turned his head, but found nothing unusual. "What is it?" He narrowed his eyes slightly, but vigilantly picked up his quiver and short bow, and said to the paladin, "Lead the way." The paladin wanted to say something, but stopped. He did not understand Roddy's behavior, as if he was ready to fight at any time, but he could not say anything. He could only shut his mouth and lead Roddy to the Baron's mansion 2 streets away. The sky was gradually darkening, and the residents of the town had gradually returned home. The empty streets were quiet again. The convoy brought by Blake had arrived in front of the Baron's mansion. Sodeler said with a smile, "Viscount Tranka has really spent a lot of money to send so many congratulatory gifts. I'm a little flattered." "It's my pleasure." Blake squinted his eyes and said a few flattering words but looked around. "Lord Viscount told me to greet Captain Roddy in person, saying that there is a special gift for him to thank him for resolving the crisis for Lord Angmar." Although this sounded fine, saying it in front of Sodeler seemed to be a bit provocative. Sodeler frowned slightly, but before he could answer, he heard Blake continue, "Knight Wellington is famous in the EFTA territory. I wanted to greet him, but it seems that it's a pity." He clearly saw Wellington's departure, but when he said this, Blake was not angry at all. Instead, he seemed to be secretly happy. When he saw Roddy approaching under the lead of the paladin, he grinned unabashedly. Knowing is not as good as meeting in person. This must be Captain Roddy. Sodeler frowned slightly, and suddenly felt that this butler seemed to care a lot about Roddy and Wellington. After receiving a few whispered reminders from the scouts, he deliberately brought his sword, and there were 6 paladins beside him. But to be honest, Sodeler did not feel that this butler had any evil intentions. His thoughts were similar to Wellington's. The other party was at most saying some harsh words to embarrass him. How could nobles fight when they met? But just as he was thinking, he found that Butler Blake was walking directly towards Roddy. He raised his palm slightly, seemingly preparing to salute, but the gray aura that suddenly condensed made Sodeler's pupils shrink. No. Although he had never seen necromancy, the sense of danger made Sodeler's hair stand on end. He reached out to grab the hilt of his sword, but he did not expect that Roddy, who was not far away, had already reacted. At the moment when Blake raised his hand, Roddy's eyes only widened slightly, but there was no expression of surprise. Instead, he was prepared and instantly used leap. His body jumped 4 meters, and he raised his leg and kicked the butler's abdomen. Bang! Before the grayish-white spell could finish condensing, Blake was sent flying by Roddy's kick. In front of the Baron's mansion, the row of carriage drivers in front of the row of carriages watched this scene in silence. They did not understand what was going on. The surrounding paladins were even more confused. Did Captain Roddy lose his mind? Why did he kick someone down on the first meeting? The scene froze for a moment. As Blake's body fell to the ground and rolled far away, the loud explosion made Roddy feel threatened. Crack! The wooden box on the carriage suddenly shattered, and 8 tower-like black figures slowly stood up. The aura that they emitted caused the originally quiet horses to be terrified and wanted to flee. The coachmen, who were at a loss, turned around but only saw weapons flying towards them. Muffled sounds rang out one after another, and the screams of flesh and bone being separated instantly resounded throughout Payer Town. The 8 puppets that appeared on the carriage all had different shapes and sizes, but all of them were huge and full of pressure. They had the body of a human, but the skin on their bodies was black and shone with a faint luster. At a glance it was obvious that they were not flesh, but solid metal. Iron puppet! How extravagant! Damn it! At this time, only Roddy could speak. After kicking Blake away, he had already raised his short bow. But the sudden appearance of the 8 puppets had disrupted all of Roddy's plans. He did not expect the enemy to be so strong. Iron puppets. As the name suggested, they were puppets made of metal. Although they were not invulnerable, they were practically invincible in the low-level domain. Roddy still remembered that a necromancer had once used 7 iron puppets to sweep through adventurers. After the players were swept 7 or 8 times, they helplessly called them King Kong Calabash Brothers, meaning that they could not stop them at all. At that moment, the 8 puppets had already jumped down from the carriage and rushed towards Roddy with an oppressive pace. The 2 guards behind Blake had also drawn their swords and surrounded Roddy with cold eyes. Damn, they're coming for me. Roddy did not plan to fight them head-on. He activated Sprint and ran forward, at the same time yelling at Sodeler, "Back up! Call for reinforcements! Get on the horses and we'll have a chance to fight." With a few steps, he was already 2 meters away from Blake. He raised his short bow. Pooh! The arrow pierced through Blake's mouth. The grayish-white undead aura had been condensing in front of him, but the undead bone shield had been pierced through before it could finish casting. Butler Blake's face was full of astonishment when the arrow pierced through his head. However, as an undead, the arrow did not take his life. Roddy, on the other hand, had already figured out the identity of the other party from the moment he had cast the first spell. Thus, after shooting the arrow, he shifted his center of gravity and ruthlessly stomped on the other party's neck. After the sound of bones breaking, Blake's neck caved in and broke. His head was twisted at a strange angle, and he died. "Back up!" Sodeler pulled out his sword and roared. Although he was confident in his own strength, he never doubted Roddy's orders. The 8 black puppets were not fast, but their killing methods were silent and frighteningly cold. The terrified coachman did not even have the time to scream before he was smashed to death by the weapons in their hands. The 8 puppets used all kinds of weapons: long swords, 2-handed axes, maces, and chain hammers. Each was a heavy weapon that ordinary people could not use. Sodeler turned around in panic and saw a man's head being smashed by a chain hammer. Pooh! Brain juice mixed with blood splattered everywhere like a watermelon that had been smashed. The 6 paladins besides Sodeler had never participated in a battle of this level. They instinctively pulled out their swords and wanted to protect Roddy, but seeing Roddy run into the distance, they hesitated whether they should retreat, but they were only a few seconds late. The 2 guards behind Blake silently rushed over. The paladins were immediately smashed by the heavy swords and were sent flying without any resistance. Sodeler's heart trembled. Seeing the townspeople around him, he immediately shouted, "Dodge! Run if you want to live!" As soon as he finished speaking, he saw a huge black shadow swooping down. Gargoyle! Damn it! Run to the corridor! Chapter 197. Gargoyles were basically the nightmare of all land unit. Even in Roddy's impression of modern warfare, having air supremacy also represented an absolute advantage. The existence of armed helicopters in local battles was far more deterrent than cannons and tanks. This situation was also applicable in this era. In Roddy's eyes, one gargoyle was far more troublesome than 8 iron puppets. Arrows were the only form of attack that could pose a threat to the gargoyle, but it was only a threat. Even an archer at Roddy's level could only avoid the gargoyle's sharp edge when facing a diving gargoyle. The gargoyle's speed was far more ferocious than the charging cavalry. Not many people could withstand a single scratch from its claws. Run towards the corridor. Be careful of the gargoyle. Under the effect of sprint, Roddy got rid of the puppet that was chasing behind him. But then he realized that the gargoyle was not heading towards him, but was diving down from afar. Boom! A thunderous sound exploded, and the visible impact caused the entire ground to tremble for a moment. A few civilians who were running directly fell to the ground, then got up dizzily and continued to run further away. Roddy's vision was obscured by the sand and dust, but he immediately knew who the gargoyle was attacking. Only Wellington would have such a formation when he was counterattacking. But Wellington, the powerful ghost knight, could not make Roddy feel at ease. Facing the gargoyle, even Wellington could only be passive. This was the most typical case of mutual restraint between units. Before the strength exceeded a certain limit, the cavalry could not do anything to the aerial units. It seemed that the enemy was not only targeting him, but also wanted to kill Wellington as well. At this time, he also understood why Butler Blake chose to attack just now. Wellington was the only existence that could directly fight against these iron puppets. So if they wanted to finish the encirclement as soon as possible, it was best to execute it when Wellington left. What a good scheme! This bunch of bastards! Roddy turned around and shot an arrow. The arrow hit the head of an iron puppet, but the arrowhead was cut off by the puppet's pure metal head with a ding sound. The attack is ineffective. Roddy's expression became even more unsightly. He immediately shouted at Sodeler, "Ruger and Carter are on standby at the armory. Scouts should have already informed us. Go find a horse and be careful of the gargoyles in the sky." Understood. The entire town of Payer was in a strange state. The Knights Templar panicked, and so did the civilians. Only Roddy and Sodeler were still rational and clear-headed enough to judge the situation and even give orders as they ran. The Templar Knights who rushed over immediately retreated after receiving the order. They looked at the 8 black, iron men and the 2 guards who were chasing after them in shock. They raised their swords and did not know what to do. One of the Temple Knights ran too fast and did not hear the order. He ran into the puppet team from the side. Without thinking, he raised his sword and slashed at the puppet team. Unexpectedly, his short sword was embedded in the back of the puppet team. Before he could pull it out, a hammer swung at him from the side and sent him spinning away. "Idiot!" Sodeler cursed in his heart, but he could not stop this from happening. He turned into an alley on the side and disappeared from the sight of the puppets. The 8 iron puppets did not seem to be very intelligent. After thinking for a while, they turned around and tried to outflank Roddy. However, the 2 guards were much faster than the puppet. They chased Sodeler into the alleyway like a war chariot. The wooden barrels, fences, and even wooden walls in front of them were all like papyrus, shattering into pieces amidst the rumbling sounds of impact. They were firmly on Sodeler's tail, unable to completely shake him off. In comparison, the pressure on Roddy's side was much smaller. The 8 iron puppets shook the ground as they walked. Their momentum was terrifying, but their speed was obviously not fast. Roddy was not stupid enough to fight against a group of iron puppets. He kept running in front. At that moment, his thoughts were very clear. His own combat power was not enough to solve the problem head-on. The only one who had this ability was Wellington. So, how to solve the problem around Wellington became Roddy's only focus. Speaking of which, Roddy was in a very bad situation. Fortunately, Roddy relied on his vigilance to win the initiative in this extremely passive situation. Blake did not expect his encirclement to be seen through. He also did not expect that with all his abilities, he would be directly trampled to death before he could even cast half a spell. As the specific planner of this operation, his death meant that the puppets would lose their command and could only rely on their instincts to complete the task. This was an advantage that was created from countless disadvantages. Roddy only thought for a moment before he came up with a plan. He did not stop and used leap to jump onto the roof of a nearby house. But before he ran a few steps, he heard the sound of horse hooves and instantly frowned. The strange sound of horse hooves was definitely not from a scout or a holy knight. Roddy turned his head and suddenly felt a chill permeate the air. At the end of the street, a puppet knight with a shining metallic luster appeared. This was the true horror of the iron puppets. The puppets they summoned could not only use weapons, but could also ride warhorses and become cavalry. The puppet knight that appeared in front of him was riding a skeleton warhorse that was fully armored and holding a silver lance. It was charging straight towards the tall figure in the distance. Obviously, it was specially used to deal with Wellington. Roddy paused for a moment and narrowed his eyes to look at the surrounding buildings. After confirming a direction, he quickly rushed over. Behind him, the 8 iron puppets crashed into a wooden shed of a stable. They did not slow down at all as they chased after Roddy with their bodies covered in straw. At the same time, Akasha tried hard to push away the wooden board that was pressing down on her body. She endured the pain and looked around. Just 10 seconds ago, she had just caught up with Knight Wellington and conveyed Roddy's words. But she did not expect that halfway through her words, Knight Wellington, who had a calm face, suddenly grabbed her arm and threw her out. Compared to Wellington, Akasha's body could only be described as weak. This throw made Akasha feel dizzy. Her body retreated for 7 or 8 meters before rolling on the ground, and before she could get up, the explosion of air made her body leave the ground. Kala, after smashing the door of the house behind her, she fell on the floor inside the house. And in Akasha's field of vision, she saw Knight Wellington pull out his sword to the sky, firmly blocking the attack of a huge black shadow. The impact of the full explosion of battle aura made the gargoyle unable to move an inch, but Wellington's feet also sank more than 10 centimeters into the ground. He blocked a fatal blow, but he did not have any spare energy to fight back. The gargoyle retreated as soon as it came into contact with Wellington. As a flying unit, it had the absolute initiative and did not need to fight with Wellington on the ground. With a flap of its wings, it rushed into the darkening sky and disappeared from everyone's sight. Wellington's eyes were gloomy as he took a step forward and jumped out of the 2 deep pits that were created by his feet. Then he turned his head to look at Akasha's direction and shouted in a deep voice, "How are you?" He knew that Akasha was brought by Roddy, otherwise he would not have asked such a question. But Akasha could not answer him at all. Her back had smashed the door, and she felt so painful that she could not even breathe. After pushing away the wooden boards that covered her body, the scene in front of Akasha's eyes was blurred. She could not even see where Wellington was. But when she heard his question, she still reached out her hand to respond. She wanted to say that she was still alive. But Wellington did not have time to answer her. The attack of the second gargoyle had already arrived. If it was not for his good hearing, he would not have been able to dodge the sharp claws that attacked from behind. Hiss! The leather armor on his shoulder was torn open. Wellington frowned. Although he had never fought with an enemy from the air, he instinctively felt that it was not a good thing to stand in an open space, so he immediately retreated to the wall of the tavern. And 15 meters away, Akasha had already cast an intermediate healing spell on herself. The pain quickly subsided, and her vision became clear. But the more it was like this, the more she understood what she had just avoided. There was really an enemy, and it was a very powerful enemy. Akasha stared blankly in front of her. She was not the only one who was knocked down by the battle aura. 3 or 4 innocent civilians were lying on the ground, the doors and windows of the tavern were completely broken, and screams were heard one after another, and in this chaos, the first thought that flashed through her mind was the words that Roddy had said just now. Find cover first, then assist in healing, understand? Assist in healing. This sentence reminded her of the cynical ridicule from those people when she was in the Viper Cross. Isn't she just a little stronger in magic? How did she get to such a high position? She's just a little beautiful. It's much easier for a woman to get to a higher position than us. I heard that she saved a lot of poor people? That's really interesting. Does she really treat the church as a charity? Ignorant woman. Akasha was very simple. She had an attitude of going with the flow. But if there was one thing that she was willing to pursue to the extreme, it must be magic. And now, the only request that Roddy had for her was to use magic to assist in healing. Akasha's eyes slightly widened, as if she had suddenly understood something. The fear of encountering a strong enemy was still there. Her body was still trembling slightly, but when she looked at the battlefield in front of her, Akasha realized that she was not as useless as she had imagined. At least she could help Roddy now. The gargoyle attacked again, and at the same time, the puppet knight with the lance attacked from afar. Wellington had no choice but to forcefully use his battle aura clone to block in front of him. But he did not have the confidence to completely block the double attack. The long sword slashed and the gargoyle was pushed back, but the clone in front of him could not block the attack of the puppet knight and was directly smashed by the lance. The strength of the opponent was beyond Wellington's imagination. But at this time, his long sword was still raised above his head, and there was no time to dodge. Just as the lance was about to hit his body, Wellington saw a golden light flash in front of him. Bang! In the muffled sound, he did not manage to dodge the lance's attack. But the strange thing was that this attack did not pierce through Wellington's body, but sent him flying. Chapter 198. Pushing the barrel away, Wellington looked down and found that the leather armor on his chest was cracked, but there were no injuries on his body. The only discomfort was the slight pain in his internal organs after the shock. Holy shield! He understood what the light just now meant, but he could not understand. How could there be a priest of the Rose Cross in Payertown? Wellington ignored the screaming crowd around him, and immediately walked out of the pub. Seeing that the puppet knight did not speed up and leave, he immediately raised his sword and prepared to entangle the opponent. Infantry would never have any advantage against cavalry, and Wellington would definitely not let the tiger go back to the mountain. The puppet knight swept its lance, and Wellington held his sword with both hands and blocked it. His movements were obviously much faster than his opponent. After blocking, Wellington rushed to his opponent's side without any hesitation, and his battle aura instantly burst out. In order to pursue the fastest attack speed, he chose to use his fist instead of his long sword for this attack. Wellington himself was more than 2 meters tall, so he did not need to raise his head to attack the puppet on the horse. He punched directly. Bang! The puppet knight had nowhere to hide, and its waist was dented by the punch. It did not even have time to take out its secondary weapon before it was directly blown to the ground. Ansiden's puppet level could not be compared to Wellington's, so in a one-on-one battle, Wellington's attributes were completely crushed. But even so, Wellington had no way to follow up with another attack, because the continuous attacks from the two gargoyles forced him to immediately take a few steps back to dodge. Because of this, Wellington could only watch as the puppet knight climbed up from the ground and prepared to mount the horse. But just as he grabbed the saddle, a complicated golden pattern suddenly flashed on the ground under his feet. The next moment, chains that seemed to be real burst out and immediately tied him up tightly. Level 2 Holy Bind. Wellington's eyes lit up, and immediately noticed Akasha, who was standing in the house casting a spell not far away. The latter's face was tense, and her lips were pursed. She then used the Holy Shield on Wellington for the second time. Opportunity. The Ghost Knight had experienced hundreds of battles, and his grasp of opportunities was far better than ordinary people. He looked at the gargoyles in the distance, and actually gave up dodging and blocking. He took a big step forward, and the sword in his hand chopped towards the puppet's head without hesitation. Crack! After a muffled sound, Wellington realized that his sword was stuck on the puppet's neck. He was actually unable to chop off his head. At the same time, the gargoyle's iron claws hit the Holy Shield, but after the golden light flashed, the shield only dimmed a little. After this round of attacks, no one could stop Wellington anymore. He let go of the sword hilt and lifted his leg to kick the puppet's abdomen. As the puppet bent over, he grabbed the metal head with both hands and roared, "Ha!" Creak! The battle aura condensed on his body, and the muscles on Wellington's arms instantly swelled up. He actually twisted the neck of the puppet knight into a fried dough twist, and with a "ka" sound it was completely torn off. The death spirit aura suddenly gushed out from the puppet's severed neck, and its struggling body immediately fell to the ground. Its metallic body started to emit black smoke as it started to shrink. At last, it turned into a palm-sized piece of black metal. Wellington heaved a sigh of relief, but just as he picked up his long sword, the gargoyle's sneak attack appeared again. In a hurry to retreat, Wellington blocked the first attack, but the Holy Shield did not withstand the second attack. The gargoyle's sharp claws slashed across, and with a rip sound, a wound appeared on his shoulder. Fresh blood spread out, but after 3 seconds, Akasha's intermediate healing magic landed on his body, and immediately the wound was clotted and healed. This is? Wellington was stunned for a moment, and then immediately understood what Akasha's skill meant. During the many years of war, Wellington had naturally received help from the priests of the Rose Cross countless times, but other than Bishop Benjamin, he had never seen anyone who could heal a wound within a few seconds. It was obvious that Akasha's talent in healing was far beyond ordinary people, but she had never realized it. For a long time, she had only heard ridicule, and no one had ever praised her level of divine arts. Therefore, at this time, Akasha did not feel that there was anything unusual. She simply suppressed her nervousness and panic, and worked hard to carry out Roddy's order to assist in healing. The 2 gargoyles hovered in the air. Wellington squinted his eyes, but it was very clear that the trouble in front of him had not been eliminated. Even with the support of the healer, he had no power to fight back, and was still in a passive state. This is a little troublesome. Wellington squinted his eyes, and his figure slowly retreated. Then, he noticed that there was a group of mighty figures at the end of the street. Looking closely, it was actually 8 puppets with black bodies, and heavy weapons in their hands. Looking closely, the target that they were chasing was impressively Roddy, who was running on the roof in front of them. In the time it took to look back, the gargoyles attacked again. Wellington seized the opportunity and used his long sword to cut off a gargoyle's claw, but the blade of the sword began to bend, and the subsequent resistance became more and more strenuous. And from afar, Roddy ran straight here. He moved extremely fast on various roofs, and casually left the 8 puppets behind by 40 to 50 meters. This was the most commonly used basic skill of the ranger profession, which was also commonly known as kiting. Of course, Roddy did not intend to keep running. When he was about 100 meters away from Wellington, he clearly saw the 2 gargoyles hovering in the sky. Then, he glanced at the surrounding terrain, and also noticed the flashing light on Wellington's body, confirming that Akasha was also nearby. This is easy. With a plan in mind, Roddy immediately sped up and rushed towards Wellington. When he was still a distance away, he directly shouted, "Change positions and attack. You deal with these puppets, I will deal with the gargoyles." Roddy did not care at all that the puppets heard this, because he knew that these guys basically had no intelligence. Wellington immediately understood his intention. The 8 iron puppets were much easier to deal with than the gargoyles, but his only worry was, how could Roddy rely on a bow to deal with 2 gargoyles? Akasha, give me a shield. Roddy once again confirmed that the gargoyle's target was completely on Wellington, and without hesitation, he ordered Akasha. Then, he directly jumped to the 3rd floor of the tavern, opened the talent bar, and added the 2 talent points he had accumulated to enhanced concentration shooting. Enhanced concentration shooting, 2/5 effect. Reduces the maximum aiming time by 1 second, increases the maximum damage by 10%. Eagle's Eye Ring was activated, and the effect of 25% increase in concentration shooting appeared. At the same time, the Holy Shield also appeared on Roddy's body. Pulling out the explosive arrow from the quiver, Roddy raised the short bow, and directly aimed at the gargoyles that were diving from afar. His current position was very special. The 3rd floor of the tavern was less than 8 meters from the ground, and right below him was Wellington, who was ready to fight. The 8 iron puppets were already near here, because they noticed Wellington's existence. Each of them raised the heavy weapons in their hands, and had already prepared to attack. At the same time, the rapidly flying gargoyles took the opportunity to attack, and attacked Wellington from the front and the back. The Spirit Knight dodged and blocked, and took a few steps back. This scene had happened several times before, and Wellington's defense always made them return empty-handed. So, after the attack, they still flapped their wings and left like before. But this time, they did not expect that at this time, there would be a human standing at a position higher than them, and was concentrating on aiming. Every time the gargoyles attacked, there would be a pause of about half a second, and it was during this pause that ordinary people would not be able to notice that Roddy's arrow had already shot out. The arrow that killed the bone-armored giant elephant was now strengthened by 10%, and the rotating explosive arrow could not be dodged at a distance of more than 10 meters. It directly exploded on the left wing of a gargoyle. Pa! There was a flash of fire, and the fragile root of the gargoyle's wing was directly blown off. Gargoyles were not animals, and normal arrows would not be able to cause any damage. But to directly blow off the wing was a completely different matter. This meant that the gargoyle had completely become trash that could be trampled on. But just before the gargoyle fell to the ground, Roddy had already made the next move. He threw away the short bow, pulled out the 2 swords, and activated Sprint and Leap. He sprinted 3 steps, and suddenly leaped towards the gargoyle that was about to leave. His body was completely stretched out in the air, and the 2 swords in his hands were held in a reverse grip. The direction of his leap was just in the path that the gargoyle was about to leave. This scene was deeply imprinted in the minds of Wellington and Akasha. They looked up and only felt that the gargoyle was like a lamb that was being preyed on by a hungry tiger. Even though it made dodging movements and tried to flap its wings, it still could not escape the fate of being preyed on. The next moment, the 2 swords were like the poisonous fangs of a giant snake, and it went straight into the back of the gargoyle. The gargoyle screamed in pain, and frantically flapped its wings to fly away. At the same time, its body tried to spin, trying to throw Roddy off. The world was spinning, and Roddy could not control his balance, but he did not even think about controlling his balance. The only thing that Roddy could do was to close his eyes and stabilize his body. Then, he grabbed the hilt of the swords and suddenly tore them apart. Go to hell! The gargoyle's screams stopped abruptly, and then countless cracks appeared on the surface of its body. It actually turned into a statue in an instant and fell straight to the ground. Chapter 199. When Roddy killed Blake, Natha, the wood elf, was investigating the whole town. She did not notice the ongoing battle at all. Walking on the roof and eaves, Natha was full of curiosity. As a wood elf who had never been to the human world, Par Town was a huge shock to Natha. The smelly stables, the tinkling blacksmiths, the vendors packing up their stalls and preparing to close, the bustling taverns. Everything was something that Natha had never seen before. Natha felt very uncomfortable at the beginning. She was like a fish out of water. Even though everything here looked much more advanced than in Aisha village, she still felt empty in her heart. The more she walked in the town, the more she felt that she did not fit in. However, Natha never thought about giving up. The stubbornness in her heart suppressed some of the distracting thoughts. What she was thinking about was the consideration of this town. She wanted to know if these humans were trustworthy. For Natha, this question could be understood as, were humans really stronger than wood elves? In the forest where the weak were prey to the strong, the wood elves' ideology was still relatively primitive. To put it simply, they had an instinctive respect for the strong. But it was also because of this that Natha always had doubts about the abilities of humans. Even though Roddy was strong, she knew that one person did not represent the whole. What Natha cared more about was the strength of the human army in this town. Only when she saw the strength of humans could Natha stop worrying about the future of Aisha village. So, with this mentality, her first goal in exploring around Par Town was to observe the humans who could fight. Whether it was scouts, cavalrymen or town patrols, they were all her targets. However, what she did not know was that all the scouts had entered a state of level 1 combat readiness, and were all hiding near the armory. The only troops standing outside the town were the original guards of the town and the temple guards who were acting as guards of honor. Natha was able to determine their identities from the weapons they were wearing, but it was clear that the patrolling soldiers squatting in the corner of the wall and gambling with the dice made her expression turn ugly. Is this the human that Roddy mentioned who can solve problems? Their long swords were rusted and did not look like weapons on their bodies at all, but more like fire sticks. There were several groups of patrolling soldiers like this, but they were all loose and undisciplined. They walked unsteadily and did not have much fighting power. The only plausible explanation was the group of Holy Temple guards standing along the street. They were wearing the full set of metal armor of the church. Their aura was passable, but their combat power. Before she could come to a conclusion, Natha's body was shaken by the sudden burst of air, causing her to stagger. She almost missed a step and fell off the wall. What's going on? She raised her head and heard the sound of something crashing from afar. There was a flash of light which allowed her to see the two gargoyles swooping down from the sky. What the hell is that? Natha's mind was filled with questions. She did not understand the human world, so she did not know what the appearance of the gargoyles meant. So at this moment, she calmly looked around and tried to memorize the terrain. But the following explosion made Natha gradually frown. When she turned her head, she saw the Thane, who had spoken to Roddy previously. But this Thane could not be more embarrassed at this moment. He was trying to find a way out from the narrow alley between two wooden houses and then madly ran into the distance. In the next moment, the walls of the two wooden houses were directly smashed into pieces. Two tall figures wielding long swords stepped out from the sky full of debris and dust, and chased after him without hesitation. The temple guards by the side of the street were stunned for a moment, but then they decisively raised their swords and met the enemy head-on. Obviously, their battle awareness was not bad, and they quickly understood what was going on. 6 armored temple guards surrounded them, sealing off all of the enemy's attack route. But in the next moment, Natha, who was standing not far away, widened her eyes in shock. The 2 puppet guards did not even bother to block and allowed the swords to slash their bodies. Ka-ka-ka, sounds of impact could be heard, but the temple guards realized that their swords could only leave a few marks on the puppet guards' bodies. Bang! The puppet guards' counterattack came one after another. With just a simple sweep of their swords, the group of temple guards were sent flying like garbage being swept away by a broom. The broken swords and dented armors were proof of the terrifying strength of the 2 puppet guards. At this moment, Natha also understood that something unexpected had happened. But when she gripped the short bow tightly, she suddenly felt a little helpless. This is a battle between humans. Is there a need for me to participate? But this question only appeared for a moment. When she thought of Roddy's action of saving Elsa's village, Natha immediately felt indescribably ashamed of her thoughts just now. In the next moment, Natha stretched out her hand and drew her sword. Without saying a word, she aimed at the two puppet guards. Pa! After Roddy's adjustment of the short bow, it was much easier to use. But then she realized that the long arrow actually slid past the puppet guards' bodies, and did not cause any damage at all. These were not creatures of flesh and blood at all, but two completely moving steel monsters. Natha's expression changed slightly, but she did not believe it. She immediately drew her arrow, and was about to launch a second round of attack. But then she sensed something streaking across the sky and suddenly lowered her head. At the same time, a gargoyle instantly swept past at a low altitude. Its huge wings brought about a strong gust of wind that caused Natha's cloak to flutter, and even the hood on her head to fall down. Her dark brown long hair was blown by the strong wind. Natha gritted her teeth as she looked at the gargoyle that had caused her to be in a sorry state. She raised her short bow and tried to take aim, but then she discovered in despair that the gargoyle had instantly flown over 100 meters away, far beyond Natha's attack range. The two puppets didn't pay any attention to Nada and continued to chase after Sodalar. Although Sodalar loudly ordered the temple knights to move away, the temple knights did not have the slightest consciousness to obey, and all of them eagerly surrounded him. This result was naturally tragic. 10 seconds later, the 8 temple guards who tried to stop the puppet guards were lying on the side of the road in various postures, screaming in pain with broken bones and tendons. Seeing this scene, Natha, who originally did not think much of it, inexplicably panicked. The puppet guards were obviously not huge beasts, but they gave her an inexplicable deterrent like a giant elephant in bone armor. Her attacks were ineffective, and her attempts to stop them were ineffective. Even an anvil lying on the side of the road was kicked away by them. How could she resist such an enemy? The well-equipped temple guards were utterly defeated, and the sword-wielding patrols ran away faster than anyone else. Looking at everything in front of her, Natha's heart turned cold. Was Roddy's so-called promise to let Elsa village rely on this group of incompetent people to protect it? Sodalar's order echoed in the distance. Natha reached out to tuck her messy hair behind her ears, her gaze becoming increasingly indifferent. If that's the case, then it's better to go back early and contribute to the village. It's better than letting this group of incompetent people provide some protection. With this thought in mind, Natha no longer had the will to fight. But before she could make her next move, she suddenly heard the undisguised sound of horse hooves. At first, it seemed to be only a few horses, but in the blink of an eye, the sound suddenly grew louder, even causing the ground to tremble. Cavalry, charge! A short but impassioned order suddenly rang out. A large group of cavalry suddenly rushed out from the end of the street corner. They were clad in armor, and the first 3 rows of cavalry wielded a 3 and 4 meter long spear in their hands. They were silently and oppressively charging straight from the distance. The sound of horse hooves rumbled like thunder, and Natha, who was seeing a cavalry group charge for the first time, was dumbfounded. It was clearly a group of less than 40 people, but when the first 3 rows of cavalry raised their spears and pointed forward, the biting cold murderous intent made Natha involuntarily take a step back. This was definitely a valiant warrior that the temple guards could not compare to. They had experienced hundreds of battles, and were full of hot blood. Under absolute orders, these cavalry that had killed more than 400 beastmen were fearless. They were true soldiers, true war machines. The group sped up at full speed, and when Sodalar hid in the side alley, the cavalry raised their spears and pointed them at the 2 puppets that could not dodge in time. With such a commotion, the 2 puppets instinctively raised their swords and prepared to fight back. But they only managed to move halfway, and Luge, who was charging at the front, had already stabbed his spear towards the puppet's chest. After a month of hard training, Luge would not miss a single stab at a fixed target. Dong! The metal spearhead struck the puppet's body, and the sturdy body caused the spearhead to distort. The huge recoil caused the spear to break on the spot. But this was only the first strike. Almost at the same time, 7 other spears struck the 2 seemingly indestructible puppets. The sound of the spears breaking rang out incessantly, but the puppets standing on the ground could not stop the terrifying impact of the scouts. Their heavy bodies retreated several steps, and finally cracks appeared on their bodies. However, after the first row of cavalrymen swept past, the scouts behind them wielding longswords were the ones who caused the most damage. Their lances disrupted the puppet's counterattack. Just when the puppet lost its balance, a dozen long swords smashed into the puppet's body one after the other. No matter how strong the puppet's defense was, they could not withstand such a powerful impact. This group was definitely an elite force that could face off against the wolf cavalry. If they were stopped by 2 iron puppets, how could they be worthy of their bodies and abilities that had been through mountains of corpses and seas of blood? In the blink of an eye, the cavalry swept up a cloud of smoke and dust and crushed over the iron puppets. The 2 iron puppets, who had been insufferably arrogant just a moment ago, had become scrap metal lying on the ground, covered in horse hoof prints. Natha's entire body was trembling, because this group of terrifying armored cavalry made her tremble like when she was facing a horde of beasts. However, she had overlooked a fact at this moment. The horde of beasts numbered in the hundreds, but the cavalry in front of her had less than 40 people. Not a single one of the scouts was injured, and they continued to outflank the enemy without stopping. Natha turned her gaze towards the street that was flashing with light. Because she was standing at a higher position, she just happened to see the scene of Roddy jumping down from the roof and directly pouncing on the body of the gargoyle. Hissing and screaming, the spinning body froze in the air and then fell. Boom! The shattered gargoyle smashed into a stone house in front of Natha, creating a huge hole in the roof. As for the fellow that killed it, he flew diagonally into the stable at the side. Chapter 200. It seemed that just a minute ago, the impression that humans gave Natha was lazy, incompetent, and easily defeated. The performance of Pear Town's patrol team and the temple guards had completely made Natha give up on humans. However, the appearance of the scout team was like a thunderbolt, instantly crushing those unstoppable puppets. Their attacks were crazy, but their posture was as steady as a farmer harvesting wheat. The whole team gave people an oppressive feeling of strength. At this moment, countless questions popped up in Natha's mind. She did not understand why there was such a difference in strength between humans, and when she saw Roddy killing the gargoyles in the air in a valiant manner, Natha's eternally frozen face even showed an expression of surprise. Roddy's fighting style was really too amazing, that indomitable madness would shock anyone who saw it. When the gargoyles fell to the ground, they directly shattered into countless stones, and Roddy crashed into the pillars of the stable, smashing into bundles of hay amidst the collapsing sound. The distant street flashed again, and the sound of the scouts' horse hooves still echoed in her ears, but Natha's gaze was fixed on the collapsed stable, and she gritted her teeth and jumped off the wall, cough. Reaching out to push away the hay on top of him, Roddy only felt as if his lungs were leaking, and he did not know how many bones in his back were broken. The sharp pain made him unable to move. The only thing he could use was his right hand. As long as he was still alive. This was the only thought in Roddy's mind at this time, and then he struggled to open his eyes to look at the battle record. After seeing the words, "killed gargoyles," he finally heaved a sigh of relief. Roddy had used this kind of attack 3 or 4 times against the undead in year 596 against the high-level gargoyle puppets. It was because of this experience that Roddy was able to accurately grasp the opponent's flight path, and thus succeeded in one shot. However, he had paid a heavy price. If he had fallen directly into the pile of straw, he would have lost at most 20% of his health. However, he had crashed into the solid wooden pillar. If not for the holy shield absorbing 650 points of damage, Rhodey would have been left with more than 24% of his health. There was blood on his forehead sliding down his cheek, but Roddy did not bother to wipe it away, and his mind was trying to piece together the information one by one. He knew that Wellington might not be at a disadvantage against the 8 puppets, but he also knew that he could not kill all of them. One-on-one was not a problem, but 1v8 was really difficult, and the cavalry team could help solve this problem, but, Roddy suddenly thought, the street where Wellington and Akasha were at was too narrow, and the cavalry's power could not be unleashed at all. The street was only 4 meters wide. If they hastily launched a charge, not only would the crowded team not be able to rush, but it was very likely that the 8 iron puppets would firmly block them, and cause great damage. Launching a charge under such conditions would definitely not bode well for them. What gave Roddy a headache was that at this time, Wellington did not know from which direction the scout would come to help, and the scout did not know what kind of enemy Wellington was facing. If Roddy did not remind both sides, the consequences would be unimaginable. However, looking at the remaining 24% of his HP, Roddy slowly exhaled, and directly turned the interface to the experience points interface. Thank God, it's actually enough. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Outside the collapsed stable came the sound of hurried footsteps. Natha rushed over without any nonsense. She could see Roddy's exposed leg, so she moved the heavy wooden pillar, but no matter how hard she tried, the pillar did not move at all. Her strength was too weak. But Natha did not have the slightest intention of giving up. She pursed her lips and reached out to pull the broken wooden shed to the side, but halfway through her action, she heard a simple sentence coming from the ruins. Level up. The next moment, the huge wooden pillar was pushed away with a clang sound, and Roddy stood up from the ruins with his body full of straw and oats. Roddy? Natha had been shocked many times today, but whether it was the powerful scouts, or Roddy's craziness in killing the gargoyles, it was still within the acceptable range. But after falling from such a high place and smashing into the stable, he was not injured at all. Natha really could not figure out how Roddy did it. But Roddy did not have time to explain to her. He shouted, "Go help," and rushed out of the ruins like the wind. He directly jumped onto an old horse that was not smashed by the wooden shed, and ran towards the street where Wellington was. Not far away, Ruger and Carter's team had already confirmed the enemy's position. The 2 captains threw away their broken lances and pointed their swords to the sky, ready to shout charge. Ruger! Carter! But at this critical moment, Roddy's shout caused the 2 captains to suddenly stop. Don't attack here. Go to the street in front and wait for orders. 4 groups charge, first row with shields to attack. Roddy did not have any weapons in his hands, and there was a pile of dried straw hanging on his body. But as soon as he finished speaking, all the scouts who were ready to charge raised their hands and pulled the reins together, turning their horses around and charging towards the street in the distance. Among them, 7 scouts, including Ruger and Carter, picked up the round shield on the side of the warhorse and equipped it on their left arm. As they moved, they rushed to the front and silently formed a formation. The long period of training and cultivation of discipline was undoubtedly reflected at this moment. And after giving the order, Roddy turned his horse around and tried hard to kick the old horse's abdomen, rushing towards Wellington, who was in a stalemate with the puppets. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 8 iron puppets were besieging the Wellington knight. The heavy weapons in their hands swept through the air one after another, and the sound of the weapons colliding was deafening. The spirit knights were fighting fiercely. 2 shadows formed by battle aura frantically blocked the attacks from the left and right. The real body in the middle roared angrily and struck the chest of the puppet in front of it 3 times in a row, directly sending it flying. When he was attacked by the gargoyles, Wellington did not have the ability to fight back. But when the enemy changed to weapon-wielding puppets, Wellington completely unleashed his full strength. In an instant, he was evenly matched with the 8 puppets, and even had the momentum to suppress them. But as time passed, Wellington's advantage gradually disappeared. No matter how he attacked, the 8 puppets advanced and retreated, and cooperated well. Wellington did not manage to kill any of them. And whether it was a heavy or light injury, it did not affect the puppets at all. After attacking crazily for 3 to 4 minutes, their physical strength, combat power, and coordination did not show any signs of decline. Wellington was known as one of the strongest knights in the After Territory, but as long as he was a human, his physical strength would eventually have a limit. The advantage of the Spirit Knights was the short-term explosive damage ability of the doppelgangers. But as the 8 puppets dragged the battle out, Wellington inevitably fell into a disadvantage. Akasha, who had been hiding at the side, understood what this situation meant. As Wellington retreated, she had to run out of the house to ensure that Wellington was within her spellcasting range. But she did not expect that as soon as she walked out of the house, 2 of the 8 puppets gave up on Wellington and turned to pounce on her. Obviously, these guys were not completely stupid. They knew what it meant to get rid of Akasha. Although Akasha's level was not low, facing the terrifyingly heavy chain hammers and giant swords in the hands of the puppets, she obviously did not have any ability to fight back. Wellington noticed this and immediately controlled his battle aura doppelganger to stop them. But this way, his originally stable triangular formation was immediately lost. The 6 surrounding puppets took the opportunity to cut in and immediately left a few wounds on Wellington's body. And the doppelganger that went to protect Akasha was also weakened due to the time limit. It was hit by the 2 puppets' swords and hammers, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into smoke. Run! Wellington only had time to shout this word, but it was obvious that he had tried his best. Akasha was not stupid. She turned around and prepared to run away. But just as she turned around, she saw a madly galloping horse brushing past her. Rhodey's bow had already been left on the roof of the tavern. His swords were also stuck in the gargoyle's body and could not be found. That was why he did not have any weapons in his hands as he rode the horse. Facing the 2 puppets, Rhodey had no other choice but to use the most primitive method of ramming. Just like when Sally hit the wolf rider, Roddy drove the horse towards the puppets. But he obviously would not be stupid enough to wait for the ramming. When he was still 10 meters away from the puppets, Roddy directly used the leap skill to jump to the side. The horse did not have a strong impact as a warhorse, but because the direction it was moving in was right in the direction of the 2 puppets, they had to raise their weapons and choose to deal with it. The heavy sword slashed the horse's head, and the chain hammer smashed the horse's ribs. With just 2 hits, the horse directly died on the ground. But the death of the horse bought a few seconds for Roddy and Akasha. After Akasha saw that it was Roddy in front of her, her original timidity and fear seemed to have disappeared. After taking a few steps back, she actually stood firm and used the last bit of her magic power to add a holy shield to Roddy's body. But Roddy did not have time to thank her. He directly shouted to Wellington, "Go through the alley and take them to the next street. There is cavalry support." Wellington waved his hand to force the 2 puppets to retreat. At this time, his mind was clearer than anyone else. With a wave of his long sword, he turned around and retreated to the alley not far away. But the 6 puppets followed him. The 2 puppets that were originally attacking Akasha did not leave. They actually targeted Roddy and Akasha and directly waved their weapons to attack them. The heavy weapon did not have any fancy attack method. It was just a simple slash, but the attack range was too large. Roddy could not even dodge it even if he wanted to. The chain hammer that was covered with spikes had amazing damage. When it swung down, it only took 1 hit to make the holy shield, that was at full strength, become extremely dim. and the giant sword that followed directly smashed the shield. Roddy raised his sword awkwardly and blocked the sword blade that had not yet weakened. But the heavy force made him groan and almost lost his balance. Akasha's magic power was completely exhausted. At this time, she could only watch as Roddy blocked in front of her. There were countless strange emotions flowing in her heart, but she was speechless for a moment. But soon she reacted. She immediately gritted her teeth, turned around and chose to escape. Akasha was not afraid. On the contrary, she did not have a trace of fear at this time. She knew that this was the only way for Roddy to have more opportunities to escape. But after running out, Akasha could not help but look back. And this glance, she just happened to see the scene of the chain hammer smashing towards Roddy. "Be careful!" Akasha screamed, but her heart was already cold. She had already seen the power of the chain hammer. Not to mention, people, even a solid stone wall would end up being smashed by the hammer. Chapter 201. When the heavy sword and the chain hammer descended, time seemed to slow down. In this desperate situation, Roddy had no room to dodge, so he did not retreat. Instead, he took a step forward and rushed towards the weapon. At the same time, he activated the Turtle Shell Protection skill. A few days ago, Roddy had borrowed the Snake King Sakya to use this skill, but he did not feel any discomfort. But the moment he activated the Turtle Shell Protection, Roddy felt as if his brain had been stirred. The severe headache made him blacked out and he almost cried out in pain. This pain was similar to when he had just tamed the snapping turtle. It appeared in an instant and dissipated quickly. What replaced it was an inexplicable power that instantly spread throughout his body. The next moment, the puppet's heavy sword slashed onto the short sword that Roddy had raised to block. With a "kang," the sword was broken, and the heavy sword smashed onto Roddy's left shoulder. The huge chain hammer from the left also attacked. Roddy could not dodge and could only raise his left arm. His arm was like a bean sprout compared to the metal hammer. Akasha, who was running, even covered her mouth, as if she could already see the scene of Roddy being smashed into meat paste. But after 2 muffled sounds, Akasha found that Roddy was still standing there, and he did not retreat a single step. The heavy sword smashed onto Roddy's shoulder, and with a "ka" sound, it flew up high. And after the chain hammer hit Roddy's arm, it actually bounced back with a "pung" sound. Roddy's shoulder and arm were splattered with blood, but the wound was only at the level of a flesh wound. Even the bones were not broken. Not only that, Roddy took the opportunity to step forward, arrived at the puppet's side, and directly twisted his body, immediately using the reverse strike skill. Ka! A wave of power instantly added to the broken sword in Roddy's hand, and the puppet that could not dodge in time had its throat cut by 2/3. However, Roddy's eyes turned cold. He knew very well that as long as the opponent's head was not chopped off, it would never stop attacking. The other puppet's chain hammer came at him again. The 3 seconds of turtle shell defense was still in effect. Roddy gritted his teeth and gave up on dodging, choosing to fight it head-on. Bang! The chain hammer was ineffective again. It was as if it had hit steel instead of flesh. However, Roddy's expression did not look good either. Seeing that the 3 seconds were about to end, he had already prepared sprint and leap to dodge and escape. However, he suddenly heard the clear sound of horse hooves and a loud shout, causing his heart to shake. Sodeler had arrived. After the scouts killed the 2 puppet guards, Sodeler immediately picked up his weapon and rode his horse to follow them. When he saw that Roddy was in trouble, Sodeler single-handedly rushed into the street and arrived just in time to help Roddy out of his predicament. Roddy did not shout. He just glanced at Sodeler, who was running at high speed, and waved the broken sword in his hand, forcing a puppet to retreat. Then he activated leap and barely dodged the 3rd attack of the chain hammer. Just as the bodies of the two puppets stiffened, Sodeler arrived swiftly and fiercely swung his sword. The puppet whose neck was already severed immediately had its head separated from its body with a crack, and its metal head flew out along with the dissipating necromancy chi. The remaining puppet was stunned for a moment, then immediately chose to continue attacking Roddy. But at this time, because of Roddy's delay, Akasha had already wisely run far away, so he had no more worries and immediately activated Sprint to retreat. For a moment, the remaining puppet could only choose to chase. Roddy ran towards Sodeler, who had turned his horse around. When he saw Sodeler move again, he twisted his body and threw the broken sword at him. The puppet instinctively blocked, and his movements revealed a flaw. Sodeler immediately seized the opportunity. His body suddenly flashed with a faint light, and with a loud shout, he decisively cut off the puppet's head. Obviously, this month's training with Wellington had not been in vain. A horizontal slash combined with battle aura ended the battle. Two puppets were beheaded. At the same time, the rumbling sound of horse hooves could be heard from the next street. 6 iron puppets that could not be considered as puppets were instantly drowned by the flood of steel. The cavalry used the powerful impact to directly destroy the puppets that could not resist in time. Facing elite cavalry, there was no suspense in this battle. When Sodeler caught up with the scouts, the street was only left with a pile of scrap metal with missing arms and legs. Of course, Roddy did not stay idle. He used a bandage to bandage his arm while calling for Akasha to stop. At the same time, he brought her to the edge of the battlefield to treat the wounded. The 6 puppets were not weak, but their stubborn resistance still caused 3 scouts to fall off their horses. This kind of falling off in the middle of a charge was extremely serious. If one was unlucky, it was normal to die immediately. Fortunately, these 3 scouts did not directly die. Under Akasha's timely beginner recovery, their lives were saved. Beginner recovery was a hot, continuous healing type spell. Its consumption was extremely low, so Akasha could use it after recovering a little of her mana. She was really useful. Roddy secretly rejoiced in his heart that it was really the right choice to bring her all the way here. When he saw that none of the scouts died and all the puppets were destroyed, Roddy finally let out a deep breath and sat directly on the ground. The gargoyle, whose wings were blown off by him, was still struggling. Wellington walked over with his long sword, raised his fist and smashed the gargoyle to the ground. Then, he stepped on the gargoyle's back and used the long sword to smash the gargoyle's head off. Wellington remained silent, but it was obvious that he was venting his anger. The chaos in Pear Town finally ended. The town that was lively just now suddenly became quiet. Most of the residents did not know what had happened. They only heard the continuous crashing and exploding sound. They wanted to come out to take a look, but because of the scouts' charge, they were so scared that they did not dare to open the door. Roddy sat on the ground and panted heavily. Although he had recovered his HP through leveling up, the battle with the 2 puppets really made him suffer. Fortunately, Akasha also used beginner recovery on him after she recovered some mana. Otherwise, this kind of pain would really be unbearable. Sodeler did not immediately come over. He led a team of scouts to patrol around the town and continued to look for possible enemies. Wellington threw the long sword to the side with a clang. He held a roll of linen bandage in his hand and silently bandaged the area between his thumb and forefinger. The bodies of the 8 iron puppets were too hard, and the recoil was a little too much for this ghost knight. The gargoyle brazenly attacked us. The undead have shed all pretense of cordiality. Wellington sat next to Roddy, tidied up his clothes that were full of scars and mud, and tightened the bandage. His tone seemed to be as calm as before. "What do you think? This is not Magda's style. This is the doing of a necromancer." Roddy frowned, his eyes unconsciously staring at the iron puppets that had become scrap iron in front of him. "That letter said that Ancidin will only come in December. If he came to Gig Town earlier, it would definitely be Magda who came to take revenge. But iron puppets. Ancidin, Rhodey, who was muttering to himself, suddenly froze. His mind suddenly recalled a piece of information that he had almost forgotten. From the first time he saw the name Ancidin, he felt that it was familiar. At that moment, he realized that it was not that Ancidin did not have any fame, but rather, his fame was left to that famous nickname. Tycoon and Ancidin was a Western-style name, but Chinese players liked to give nicknames in their own way. And the reason why Ancidin was called Tycoon was because every time this necromancer fought, he would bring a whole team of luxurious puppets. There was a huge difference between a puppet that was summoned with scrap iron and a puppet that was summoned with magic weapons. Ancidin's puppets, without exception, were all summoned with various kinds of precious materials. In other words, they were puppets that were created by burning money. Therefore, Ancidin was given the nickname Tycoon. Since his first appearance in 594, he had been known by people. He had participated in many battles and had amazing achievements. He even faced the war between the undead and humans. But because of this, people almost forgot his real name. It's actually him. Roddy's brows furrowed deeper. Ancidin was in the Hawk faction of the undead. He had always been at odds with those evil elders. And the one who attacked him was him and not Magda. This meant that there must be a problem. If Magda regains his strength, he will definitely come here personally to take revenge. Rhodey said this. This was the judgment he was most confident in at the moment. Wellington didn't say anything. It was obvious that the Blighted One had left a deep impression on him. It was definitely not a good person, and no one wanted to meet it a second time. Roddy closed his eyes and rubbed his cheek. He thought hard for a moment and said in a low voice, "Now that we haven't seen Magda but met Ancidin's puppets, I'm afraid we only have two choices. Either we take advantage of the fact that Magda hasn't regained his strength and rush over to fight, or we can only prepare here and wait for them to come to us." Sighing, Roddy was also a little uncertain. He had just completed his class advancement mission. His advanced level was only level 2, and his basic level was level 11. But what about the enemies? Tycoon, who could use a puppet to kill a company of infantry, and Blighted One Magda, who had regained his strength. His only chance was in front of him. If he couldn't grasp it, facing the revenge of these two people, no matter how many lives Roddy had, it wouldn't be enough for him to die. The conflict between him and the undead had reached this point, and there was no way to stop it. There was no room for a buffer. Angmar gave you the authority to command me, so I will listen to you. Wellington slowly exhaled, and then said in a low voice, "But you definitely won't wait here." Roddy smiled bitterly. Wellington's words were naturally what he was thinking. He never liked to be in a passive position. Just like when he faced the gargoyle, he would also take the initiative to attack. The only thing Roddy could do was to rush forward and end everything before Magda regained his strength. Rest for 6 hours, we will leave at midnight. Without saying anything more, Roddy endured the pain and stood up. He said to Ruger and Carter, who were on standby, "Everyone get ready. Our target is Kyger Town. We must arrive before sunrise tomorrow." "Yes," the two captains replied loudly and in unison. After saluting, the scouts turned their horses around and left. They remained silent. "You have a plan?" Wellington knew Roddy's fighting style and knew that this guy would never fight a battle without preparation. But this time, Roddy didn't give a definite answer. He only reached out to wipe the blood stains on his arm, lowered his eyes and said lightly, Chapter 202. As dusk slowly passed, the atmosphere in Pear Town seemed to be quieter than usual. The town wasn't big, so any important news would spread within a few hours. By dinner time, everything that happened in the afternoon had spread throughout the street. Amidst the clamor in the tavern, the ones that people sighed the most were the scouts that they had ridiculed before. Who could have imagined that a group of minions that they had painstakingly trained all day could actually be so powerful? There were also many people who were secretly trembling in the corner, because they had mocked the scouts to their faces, and now they were worried that the scouts would swing their swords at them. The battle in the afternoon had caused many people to be injured, but in the end no one died, so the atmosphere in the tavern was very relaxed. Other than guessing the identity of the enemy, another topic of discussion was about the Holy Knights. Until now, the Holy Knights had been linked to the words for show, and became a term used in the tavern to mock and ridicule each other. And these main characters that would always appear in the tavern seemed to have all disappeared today, and not a single one of them appeared. The group of scouts had already organized their troops. If we were to charge on horseback, we would definitely not be any weaker than them. We were completely caught off guard. No one had expected this to happen. Inside the dormitory of the temple guards, their unyielding words represented their resentment. They had already heard the discussions in the tavern, and the people's disdain towards the Holy Knights and respect towards the scouts formed a stark contrast from before. Some even said that they were blind to think that the Holy Knights were the protectors of the village, and so on and so forth. In short, there were many unpleasant words, and the once loyal supporters had all turned into haters. It would be strange if the Holy Knights were happy. But after this incident there was no way to reason with them. How would the commoners understand the strength of the puppets? They would only look at the results and not the process. Who killed the puppets? Who was chased away by the puppets? This was an undeniable fact. The bishop and the governor did not send us here to be humiliated. I want to find Roddy. A young man threw his gloves on the ground angrily, and stood up to leave the room, but he was quickly grabbed by the shoulder by an older knight, and firmly pressed back. Have you forgotten who you are? Humiliated? Who insulted us? No. No one has ever insulted us, understand? Those scouts. We laugh at them every day for running around like monkeys, but what about when it's time to charge? You dare to say that we are stronger than those scouts? Are you confident that you are stronger than them? This 32-year-old knight had participated in several large-scale battles. He was the oldest in the team, so his words carried the most weight. In the afternoon, he was injured by a puppet and fell to the side of the road. From the beginning to the end, he witnessed the scene of the scouts charging at the puppets with their lances in hand. The murderous aura that assaulted his face left a deep impression on him. Compared to them, these arrogant holy knights were not on the same level. These scouts were not knights that needed to be bound by faith. They were more like weapons that did not need to think and only needed to execute the order to kill. Only those who had fought on the battlefield would know the terror of such existences. Those guys were real war machines, the most simple butchers of the battlefield. The young knight could not understand this gap, and still said indignantly, "Then what should we do? Just watch them push him down? Push him down? Think about it, if they really wanted to push us down, why would they wait until today?" This sentence made the young knight speechless. In fact, anyone with a brain would understand that these scouts had completely ignored them. From the beginning, they did not see them as a target to surpass. Hearing his words, the few veteran knights lowered their heads slightly. The young knight who was pushed down looked around and realized that no one was responding to him. In the end, he could only sit back down gloomily, wait for Lord Roddy's orders. This is the only thing we have to do. As the knight finished his sentence, the door of the house was pushed open. A faint voice echoed as the footsteps entered. Well said. All the holy knights in the house looked over and realized that the person who entered was their master in name, Roddy. At this time, the sky was completely dark. The candlelight in the house swayed, and when it shone on Roddy's body, the soldiers noticed the bandages on his shoulders and arms. Immediately, they also remembered Roddy's terrifying combat power in this battle. The screams of the gargoyles struggling to be killed still echoed in their ears, causing the atmosphere in the house to suddenly become quiet. A second later, the house was filled with the noise of everyone standing up and saluting. Roddy stood there quietly, looking at these soldiers calmly, his expression cold and solemn. Battle order. All members set off at midnight, arrive at the outskirts of Kyger Town before dawn and await further orders. Yes. The knights were surprised, but because of Roddy's performance today, they did not dare to ask any questions. Roddy was also not interested in explaining anything, because in his eyes, professional soldiers only needed to obey. There was no need for anything else. Originally, Roddy did not want these forces that he had yet to fully control to go into battle, but now that the situation had reached the most critical moment, he had to use all the forces that he could use. After the order was given, he looked at the few young men who still had dissatisfaction in their eyes, and before he left, he added, "Strength can only be shown on the battlefield. If you want to prove that you are stronger than the scouts, then show me." Yes. The Holy Knights were still wondering why they were in such a hurry, but after listening to Roddy's words, they no longer thought about these questions. Every one of them was full of fighting spirit, and they could not wait to rush into the battlefield and cut off the enemy's head to prove themselves. There were still 6 hours before midnight, and there were still 11 hours before the scheduled time of arrival at Kyger Town. Roddy did not waste any more time and turned to leave. At this time, the aftermath of the battlefield had been mostly dealt with. Speaking of which, his harvest was not small. The words, "Resist Ansidon's Revenge, completed," appeared in the mission bar. Because the enemies were all existences above their level, the experience points were extremely high, but the greatest harvest was the corpses of the puppets. Tycoon Ansidon lived up to his name. Even when he was not strong in the year 588, he still spent a lot of money. The summoning materials of these iron puppets were all high-grade goods. In addition to the extremely high-quality fine iron ore, there were also 10 pieces of thorium and 6 or 7 types of gems, any one of which was a precious material with a price of gold coins. In other words, killing these puppets was equivalent to giving Roddy a windfall, and it was worth a lot of money. But at this time, Roddy was not interested in dividing the spoils on the spot or considering the use of them. After settling and arranging all the relevant matters, he finally returned to his room to rest for a few hours. And the first thing he did when he entered the door was to check on the snapping turtle that he named Nokia. "The name is really right, you're really tough," opening the pet information bar. Only then did Roddy have the time to take a look at the Nokia's attributes. But after looking at it, he was a little disappointed. Because it had just hatched not long ago, the Nokia's level was not displayed as a number, but the words infant stage. Looking at the time displayed below, the words remaining 84 days, made Roddy slightly frown. It seemed that if he wanted to upgrade the Nokia and give it a fighting strength, he was afraid that he would have to wait for another 3 months, but looking at the current size of the Nokia, which was only the size of a palm, Roddy also understood that there was no other way. If the opponent had a fighting strength now, then he would really feel that it was not scientific. At this time, the temperature was cold. Even though the fireplace was very warm, but the Nokia was still in a sleepy state, preparing to hibernate. Roddy placed it in the basket and opened his attribute bar to take a look. After confirming that his HP had recovered to 94%, he secretly let out a sigh of relief. Akasha and Natha had already returned to the room that Sodaler had specially arranged for them. Roddy had previously talked to them for a while. With regards to the arrangements for these two, Roddy still had some headaches, but thinking of the next plan, he chose to give up thinking about these problems. "Let's think about it if we can survive." Roddy sighed and immediately fell asleep. He knew that he needed sufficient rest to relieve the exhaustion of his physical strength. After all, he was about to face the most powerful opponents in history. Roddy's absolute rationality allowed him to completely ignore the battle during the day, and thus fell asleep as soon as he closed his eyes. But after all, not everyone was so stupid. After the battle, Natha obviously could not immediately rest. At this time, she was sitting on the armchair in front of the fireplace, still holding her short bow in her hand. At this time, soft orange light reflected on Natha's delicate face. At this time, she had changed out of the dirty equipment during the day and put on a clean nightgown that Roddy had asked someone to send over. In the bedroom, there was a brand new set of leather armor on the bed, including a white linen shirt, brown armor, matching leather wrist guards, waist girdle, cloak, and so on. But looking at the equipment at this time, Natha at this time, there was an unusual and contradictory feeling. Half an hour ago, Roddy gave her a simple explanation of the identity of today's enemies, but Natha did not care about the necromancer. She only had one question: when will you go back to help Urza village? First, I have to survive the next battle. This was Roddy's answer. The feeling Natha had towards Roddy was very strange. Deep in her heart, she wanted to surpass him, which was the most desired goal in the depths of her heart. But most of the time, she always felt that she and Roddy were not in the same world at all. Because Roddy was busy dealing with his level of trouble, it seemed that he was not very concerned about teaching her and helping Urza village. This kind of estrangement, whether it was because of race or because of the locked heart, Natha had a feeling that she was being ostracized. Now that Roddy was going to leave, he was ready to fight desperately with those enemies, and he had to go. But what about herself? If you go with me, perhaps your archery skills can be improved by more than one level. But if you care about Urza village, then wait here. If anything happens to me, someone will follow you back to the village and fulfill my promise. Chapter 203. While Natha was in a dilemma, Akasha, who was lying on the bed, was also tossing and turning. The decorations in the room were simple, and the fire in the fireplace gradually dimmed. But the bedroom that should have been dark was now illuminated by a ray of light. Akasha raised the ring in her hand, and the soft light dispelled the darkness and dispelled the fear of the holy priest. But at this moment she looked at the ring with a somewhat complicated gaze. The curse of whipping punishment had disappeared. This matter was only confirmed tonight. When there was no more pain coming from her back, Akasha was stunned for a long time, and then she cried inexplicably. She could feel that all this did not disappear naturally, but was inextricably linked to the ring in her hand. With this ring, the power of her divine arts had even increased a little, and from the day she wore it, the effect of the curse had been weakening day by day. Today, when the damage to her body and spirit had come to an end, all that was left in her heart was the word gratitude. Although she had experienced a soul-stirring battle in the afternoon, Akasha did not feel too much panic or fear at this time. What she could recall in her mind was not the roaring gargoyles, nor was it the iron puppets waving their heavy weapons and striding towards her. When she closed her eyes, the clearest image in front of her was the tall and straight figure standing in front of her, relying on his body to block the sword and the hammer. It had to be said that the outlook on life of a technological geek was very different from this world, and some misunderstandings caused by this were even more difficult to explain. The truth was actually very simple. In Roddy's view, protecting Akasha was equivalent to winning half the battle. This was definitely the consensus of all the players, and it had even become a deep-rooted idea. In Akasha's eyes, hatred and strife had always been the two words that touched her the most in her life experience, but the word trust had never been seen before. When she suddenly saw Roddy blocking the heavy sword and hammer for her, she only felt that the enemy's weapons were not attacking Roddy, but knocking on her heart. What was the meaning of living? Akasha had thought about it before, and at different times, she had come up with different answers. But at this moment, looking at the light on the ring in her hand, she felt that she had another layer of understanding. In the stable next to the drill ground, the war horses were snorting after eating their fill. The figures of the sentries on duty could be vaguely seen under the illumination of the torches, while the scouts resting in the houses were snoring non-stop. As an order, sleep was also carried out by the scouts seriously. After a long period of fighting and training, these youths who used to be lazy and ignorant in Norland village had completely changed. Now, no matter what battle they were going to face, there was no longer any fear that could bother them. In a house not far away, the Wellington knight raised his heavy lance and placed it on the wooden table. Beside him, Sodeler was silently spinning the grinding wheel. The sound of the blade and the grinding wheel rubbing against each other echoed dully in the silent night. The heavy armor wasn't worn on his body, but placed at the side in a semi-assembled state. Wellington's body was wrapped in bandages, and he was drinking from a pot of warm ale. Unlike the scouts who existed as weapons, Sodeler and Wellington had their own considerations and thoughts for the upcoming battle, so they didn't choose to rest. After a long silence, Wellington suddenly said, "This kind of battle doesn't look optimistic." Sodeler raised his head and made a listening gesture. "We don't know where the enemy is, how many there are, or how strong they are. Suddenly deciding to rush over, although there's the effect of surprise troops, how do we do it?" In fact, he had these questions from the moment Rhodey decided to send out his troop. Sodeler raised his long sword and observed the edge of the blade against the candlelight. Then he continued to polish it on the grinding wheel. With a sizzling sound he replied, "I remember you taught me some time ago. In a war, the winner doesn't necessarily have the advantage in numbers, but it must be the one who grasps the initiative." Wellington drank a mouthful of ale and turned his eyes to the darkness. "That's right, but Roddy's actions can't be considered as grasping the initiative. It can only be called rash. But I believe in him." Sodeler stopped polishing his sword. "And you didn't refuse?" "I just didn't refuse Angmar." Wellington shook his head. "If Angmar needs me to die, I won't refuse to die on the way." This ghost knight's words weren't impassioned, but it moved Sodeler. "Since you believe in him, then I'll tell you something else." Wellington plugged the cork of the wine bag. "The swordsmanship and fighting skills I taught you before are actually not everything a knight should have. As a knight, the source of power isn't the so-called battle aura." Wellington pointed to his chest. "For me, the power of a guardian knight comes from loyalty." The night wind was still blowing, but Sodeler, who was polishing his sword, was lost in thought. In his opinion, everything that Wellington had taught him in the past month was not as important as this sentence. "Don't think about anything else. I just think you have enough potential to go further, that's why I said that. And the most important thing is, you're willing to trust someone." Wellington drank the last of the ale, stood up, and held the quaint lance tightly. He waved it twice as if it was light, and the sound of the wind sweeping through the air was unprecedented. "In fact, you and I don't have to consider much. Since you choose to trust, it's equivalent to making a judgment. Once you have made up your mind, you will become a true warrior. Don't ask how strong the enemy is, just ask where the enemy is. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Compared to the calm before the storm in Payertown, the atmosphere in Kiger Town was no different from the past. In the night when most of the residents were asleep, the Green Vine Tavern, where the mercenaries lived, was still as lively as usual. The hall on the first floor was bustling with the chatter of various mercenaries. Although it was almost winter, there was no shortage of mercenaries that could earn them money. Even if they didn't have to go hunting in the forest, escorting merchant caravans, running errands, etc. Any one of these jobs was enough for them to earn enough money for their meals. As a first-tier town in the Ifta territory, there were mercenaries from all over the place. But at this time, most of the people in the Green Vine Tavern were local mercenaries, and the news they discussed was also about the recent events. I heard that there was a large group from the south, and after resting here for a day, they entered the Silent Forest? It's called the Blood Shield Mercenary Group, and they are quite famous in the south. They do a lot of dirty work, and a few lords even put up wanted posters, but it's said that they don't dare to touch them. Such a big background? Why would they go to the forest at this time of the year? The Silent Forest is not a friendly place. If you're lucky, you can still survive if you meet the Wood Elves, but if you meet the tough ones, you won't be able to survive even if you have a few lives. Look at you, as if you've seen the Wood Elves before. Of course I have. I got lost the last time. Similar discussions could be heard everywhere, and among them, two people sitting in the corner were listening to these discussions with complicated expressions. They were Henry and Buffon, who walked out of the Silent Forest alive. If it was in the past, Henry would definitely join the group of people bragging about seeing the Wood Elves, but now that he was sitting here, he didn't have the mood to brag at all. Buffon, do you think, if we just take all these things away, we won't have to be mercenaries for the rest of our lives? His face was no longer as pale as it was in the Silent Forest. After a few full meals and hot wine, his face was now red, but his tone was mixed with a sense of pain. If we do this, it should be enough for a few decades of expenses. Buffon was eating the steak in front of him with a fork, and there was already a small pile of plates beside him. His body was as thin as a stick, and he chewed hard for a long time, then added a sentence. The point is that your conscience is still there, and the words he said before he left. Forget it, I was just saying. Henry lowered his head as if he was deflated, and also used his fork to eat the food in front of him that he couldn't afford before. Obviously, this conversation between the two was completely because they were shocked by Roddy's generosity, previously in Urza village, although Henry could recognize that these herbs were relatively rare and of good quality. He didn't expect these herbs to be so popular. In just 2 days, half of the herbs he took out to test the water caused a huge uproar in the pharmacist guild. Henry was very business-minded. He didn't choose to directly sell them, but directly bid in the pharmacist guild to make potions, thinking that he could directly sell the finished products at a high price. But when he saw that the vice president was alarmed by these herbs and came out to discuss the purchase, he made a prompt decision and directly talked with the other party about the conditions. The potion made from the herbs would be split in half, but the pharmacist guild would have to pay Henry a high fee, called herb collection fee. Such harsh conditions were originally used to argue, but who would have thought that the other party would directly agree after considering for an afternoon? As a result, Henry didn't even have the time to prepare the speech he had prepared, and he was dumbfounded as he returned to the hotel with a box of silver coins. This was a real silver coin. Moreover, they were high-quality silver from the Nile's vein, and 1 silver coin could even be worth 2 Buster silver coins mixed with impurities in the south. This box of silver coins was really an astronomical figure for Henry and Buffon. Perhaps they wouldn't be able to earn so much money even if they worked as mercenaries for a lifetime. And what made Henry most painful was that when Roddy separated from them, he simply mentioned about the payment. After all the herbs are sold, the two of you can take 10% of the silver coins for your own use, and it will be the same in the future. 10%! 10% of 480 silver coins was 48 silver coins. One must know that the previous year's best harvest of the Iron Horse Mercenary Group was only 97 silver coins, and each of them could at most get 10 silver coins, and they would be so happy that they would cry tears of joy, a simple task, and the salary was equivalent to 2 or 3 years of harvest. This kind of thing sounded like a dream, but looking at the fragrant food in front of him and touching the few bottles of potion that were enshrouded in magic power, Henry knew that he had really met a strong person. His strength was abnormal, he had a good relationship with the Wood Elves, and he was also preparing to open a trade route, Buffon was too lazy to think about the twists and turns, but Henry was very clear. If the trade route was really opened, the speed at which he and Buffon could earn money would definitely be even more exaggerated than mining. The thought of taking these 480 silver coins for himself was just a flash. Not to mention the problem of conscience, just in terms of benefits, Henry would absolutely not do such a stupid thing. This Sir Roddy really has us in his grasp. Chapter 204. Outside Kiger Town, the underground tomb. The dark underground tomb had a total of 3 floors. The first 2 floors were filled with all kinds of books and potions without any restrictions. But if one continued to go down, he would have to go through a long, narrow, spiral staircase, and pass through 3 doors with magic restrictions before he could enter the 3rd floor of the tomb. This was Ansedin's magic laboratory, and also the place where he kept all his wealth. Tycoon Ansedin, with the help of Viscount Tranca and a few other human nobles, had accumulated an unimaginable amount of wealth in just a few years. Therefore, in addition to gold and silver coins, there were also pieces of valuable thorium, mithril, and a large number of summoning materials. Logically speaking, this secret chamber should not be open to any outsiders, but at this moment, Ansedin was slightly bowing his body, trying to squeeze out a respectful expression on his relaxed and drooping face. His eyes were looking straight at the ground under his feet, and he was whispering something to the figure sitting on the stone chair in front of him. When I heard the news of the accident, I immediately summoned the gargoyles to come here, so that I could find you first. As for how to deal with these humans, I have investigated for a few days and got the list in my hands, with you here. His Majesty Augustine's mission will be completed successfully. At this time Ansedin completely had the attitude and tone of a lackey, and his respectful appearance was a world of difference from the ruthlessness he showed when he summoned the puppets to kill Roddy. And at this time, blighted Magda was sitting in front of him, seemingly resting with her eyes closed, but in fact, from the slight frown on her face, one could tell that she was in a very bad mood. It had been more than a month since the defeat in Hollier City, and the half of her body that had been pierced by the giant crossbow still had that terrible wound. With such an injury, she was not interested in listening to Ansedin's flattery, and directly raised her hand to interrupt. "I'm not interested in listening to your nonsense. Tell me, how long will it take for my body to recover?" Even if Ansedin had used a high-tier potion to solve a problem for Magda, the pride of a blighted one would not change just because of a favor owed. Class consciousness of identity and status was deeply rooted in Tasman. In the eyes of the blighters, a junior like Ansedin was nothing more than a sentinel carrying out a mission in the kingdom of Karen. There was no need to take him seriously. Therefore, he was not polite to Ansedin at all and completely regarded him as a minion. "My lord, in order to restore your body, we first need fresh corpses. If you want to restore your peak strength, we need to find the most suitable person. Moreover, we need a series of formations and casting time. How many days will it take?" He had no interest in Ansedin's plan. He only thought of himself, revenge. His only goal was to kill Roddy in the shortest time possible. Maybe 10 days at the earliest. Ansedin bowed even lower, his voice filled with cowardice and fear. And this is the optimistic situation, my lord. What do you think? I will only give you 5 days. Do it now. Magda squinted her eyes and gave him a time limit in a flat tone. My lord, no problem. But in order to help you restore your strength, I need to treat your wounds with potions now. Ansedin did not even dare to argue after being kicked by him. He quickly lowered his head and took out the potion in his hand. Magda clearly enjoyed his absolute obedience attitude. The blighter wasn't blind. He knew how precious the materials in the room were. The fact that Anzadin allowed him to receive treatment here was enough to show that Anzadin wasn't wary of him. So, in the following period of time, he cooperated and accepted Anzadin's treatment of his wounds. After everything was done, Anzadin did not say anything else. He bowed deeply and left with his head lowered. At least he knows his place. Magda reached out to touch the treated wound and gave his evaluation to Ansardin. On the other side, the sensible Anzadin's face no longer had the cowardice and fear from before. Instead, it was replaced with undisguised mockery. Arrogant old thing, you are really regressing as you live. He was very clear that ever since Black Crow found Magda's hiding place, he had stepped into his trap step by step, inviting Magda to his most precious room as a show of obedience, using a weak performance to lower Magda's guard, and making Magda think that his body needed a long time to recover. All of this was actually a pretense. With Anzadin's strength, recovering his body was a piece of cake, but he was deliberately stalling for time. The letter sent to King Augustine had already been sent to the Tasman Empire with Black Crow. If everything went smoothly, when His Majesty found out about Magda's stupid actions, he would definitely support his action of using the puppets to kill Roddy. As for Magda? At that time, she would only be an arrogant old thing in the eyes of His Majesty. She would probably not be put in any important position in the future. When he cured this old thing, Magda would probably not even know that he had been used. Not only would he lose his competitiveness in politics, he would also owe him a favor. Stupid people can't enter the parliament. So what if you are strong? Heh. Secretly laughing at Magda's stupidity, Anzadin walked back to the basement level. However, as soon as he entered the room, his eyes suddenly froze. How is this possible? On the table not far away, the magic circle that was originally flashing with 13 nodes had completely dimmed. Anzadin's eyes widened in disbelief. He quickly walked in front of the magic circle and reached out to pick up the magic crystal. However, as soon as his fingertips touched the crystal, there was a cracking sound. A spiderweb-like crack spread out, and the entire magic crystal completely turned into a pile of debris. This scene meant that the puppet had died. The magic crystal had suffered from the energy backlash and self-destructed. Anzadin's finger hovered above the magic circle. His originally shocked eyes gradually became filled with malice. His thin and long fingers slowly clenched into a fist. As the power of the dead gathered, all the magic crystal on the magic circle suddenly shattered and disappeared. Then, without hesitation, he reached out and opened a wooden cabinet door. Under the dim light, the puppet statues that were placed inside almost formed a mountain. At midnight, the sound of horse hooves could be heard in Pear Town. The scouts had already lined up neatly on the drill ground. Ruger stood in front silently waiting for Roddy's orders, while Carter walked in the middle of the team, seriously carrying out his task as a political commissar. The team of holy knights beside him seemed to be a little scattered. 20 professional knights and 20 Templar guards with gigantic shields rode on their horses, all of them in a lightly armored stance. Inside the wooden house, Roddy sheathed 2 curved swords, tightened the strap of the quiver, picked up the short bow, and reached out to put the sleeping Nokia into his waist pocket. Then, he pushed the door open and walked out. Akasha had been waiting outside the door for a few minutes. When she saw Roddy, she extinguished the light of the ring and followed him. Roddy nodded as a greeting and then said, "If there is a battle, you must stay in the middle of the team. Don't let yourself be exposed. Remember, staying alive is the most important thing." "Yes." Akasha nodded seriously and unconsciously tightened her grip on the ring in her hand. Needless to say, this beautiful priest had once again misunderstood his thoughts. At this time, Roddy's mind was recalling how to fight against the puppet necromancer. The words he said just now were completely because he was complaining about the lack of healing in his heart. When he walked to the front of the team, Roddy looked around and did not see Natha. He let out a sigh of relief in his heart. In fact, he also understood that if Natha was in her right mind, she would know very well that there was no reason for her to follow him to fight to the death. It was human nature to seek luck and avoid danger. Roddy expressed his understanding. He also did not want this former teacher to follow him to face unknown enemies. After all, these things had nothing to do with her. If she was implicated, he would feel guilty. This was one of the few emotional emotions that Roddy had. But as he walked to the front of the army, he suppressed the last trace of emotion. After roughly explaining the plan to Sodeler and the others, he directly gave the order to set off. But just as he was about to mount his warhorse and leave, Natha suddenly came in front of him and said expressionlessly, "I only have one question." Natha, who carried a short bow on her back, said indifferently. The new leather armor made her look completely different. But Roddy was not interested in observing all this. He just frowned slightly and waited for her to continue. "If you die, who will save Elsa village?" Natha's words were too straightforward and even a little harsh. But her personality was like this, and Roddy was already used to it. He opened his mouth to say someone, but when the words came to the tip of his tongue, he suddenly hesitated. No one wanted to think about what would happen after they died, and Roddy was the same. But when Natha raised the question, he suddenly realized that the promise he made before was really difficult to fulfill. "Yes, if I die, it means that these people are basically dead. If that's the case, who can help the Wood Elves? What's the point of helping them?" He could lie to others, but to Natha's teacher, Roddy was not willing to say a single lie. He shook his head and said, "Sorry, I can't guarantee this promise." After saying this, Roddy was ready to be scolded. But unexpectedly, the wood elf in front of him did not look surprised at all. She actually found a horse to ride, pulled the reins, and joined the advancing army. "This battle is very dangerous, and we may die." Roddy shouted at Natha in the elven language. "If I die and you live," in the cold wind, Natha gently pulled her hood up and said calmly, "Remember your promise." Chapter 205. Soon, the team lit torches in the dark and set off towards Gigtown. Warhorses moved quickly in the forest. In addition to the necessary weapons and dry rations, the scouts carried black bags on their back. The temple guards also carried shovels and hoes. They silently followed the team and soon disappeared into the forest. As time passed, when the sky in the east gradually turned white, a scout appeared outside the city gate of Hollier. Even his warhorse was drenched in sweat. He loudly woke up the soldiers guarding the gate and handed over the token in his hand. After the gate opened, he quickly rushed towards the ducal palace. Not long after, several soldiers on horseback rushed out of the Lucifron ducal palace to report the news. They dispersed and went to various places in the city, including the monastery, the armory, and some aristocratic mansions that were close to each other in the past. A few minutes later, Knight Titus walked out of the mansion and whispered a few words to the Dukes of Angmar. Then he flicked the reins and galloped into the distance. When the sun finally rose in the sky, Rhodey and the others had stopped at the edge of the forest of quiet whispers outside the town and started to set up camp. Most of the people in this team did not have a clear idea of what they were going to do next. Even Wellington and Sodeler did not understand Roddy's intention before they arrived at the destination. So many soldiers were a little uncertain because Roddy's behavior seemed really rash. But when the team arrived, Roddy's arrangement made Wellington feel relieved. The team took turns to adjust their condition. Half of them rested, and the other half began to dig traps and clean up the traces in the area around the forest. The bags carried by the scouts were filled with large fishing net. Par Town was built near the river, and there were many fishermen in the village. So before Roddy set off, He directly collected more than 40 fishing nets in the village, and let his men hang them on the tree trunks at the edge of the forest according to a certain height and arrangement. He pulled Natha, Akasha, Wellington, Sodeler, and held a pre-battle meeting in the middle of the camp. That's the gist of the plan. Whether we succeed or not, we at least have enough leeway to maneuver, Roddy said as he stroked the gauntlet on his arm. Previously, due to the chain hammer's attack, the frost steel gauntlet was somewhat deformed, causing its durability to drop by quite a bit. Be careful, Natha. If what I said really happens, throw away the cloak. It will hinder your movements. Also, remember the dodging method I told you. He emphasized to Natha in the elven language, and the wood elf nodded, her eyes still cold. Roddy was not surprised by her reaction. He turned to Wellington and Sodeler and said, "No matter what you encounter during the charge, Akasha will support you from behind. Also, you must protect Akasha." He glanced at the priest, who had his head lowered and pursed his lips. He frowned and said, "Don't be nervous. Just don't forget what I taught you." Yes. Akasha clenched the ring and replied with a stutter. Actually, she was not that nervous. She just felt that Roddy always emphasized the order to protect her, which made her feel a little strange. This is the gist of the plan. Everyone, eat more and try to keep your spirits up. Sodeler and Wellington, come with me later. We are going to confirm some things. Roddy looked up at the rising sun. His eyes paused for a moment on Kegtown, which was 2 kilometers away. He then shouted to Carter, "Pick 6 people, disguise as mercenaries, and follow me." Yes. Okay, that's all the orders. Dismissed. Since the pre-war preparations, all the plans had been fully implemented. Although Roddy's decision was sudden, under such a situation, he did not rush forward and start a fight. This made Wellington, who was originally dissatisfied with Roddy, sincerely convinced. In an away disadvantage, he created a home advantage and maximized the benefits brought by the initiative in a short period of time. All these measures could completely prove that Roddy was an excellent battlefield commander. In this era where illiterate people were everywhere and boorish people were as many as dogs, those who could recognize all the words in the code could be called scholars. Seeing that Roddy consciously put tactics on the strategic level, Wellington had already admitted that he was no less talented than the Dukes of Angmar. Of course, this was in the aspect of combat. As for other aspects, he still had reservations. After the arrangements were completed, Natha held the short bow and walked to the edge of the forest, not far away. She hung the spare quiver on the predetermined treetop. Akasha and a few other mercenaries inserted colorful leaves and weeds into the cloak. She occasionally looked at the leaving Roddy, pursed her lips, and then lowered her head. The Knights Templar tied the horses in the forest, and Ruger and Carter supervised the making of the traps. During this period of time, they were not just practicing the tactics of riding on horseback. How to adapt to all-terrain combat and how to survive under the most disadvantageous conditions were the essence of the special forces that scouts had to learn. And Roddy, Sodeler, and Wellington pulled up their hoods and directly entered the town of Kyger in the early morning with 6 scouts. They went straight to the tavern area where the mercenaries usually stayed. At the same time, Tranka, who was reporting to Ansadin, had no idea that Roddy and the others had quietly arrived. The details of those 2 mercenaries have been found. They are members of the Iron Horse mercenary group. A month ago, the group entered the Silent Forest, and now only 2 people came back. I think the others are dead, and the quality of the herbs they brought are here. Viscount Tranka was dressed in gorgeous clothes with a decorative sword hanging on his waist. He should have been handsome and elegant, but at this time, his posture was more like a servant. He knelt on one knee and respectfully held a few pieces of parchment with both hands. Ansadin's dead face had been frighteningly gloomy since last night. At this time, after listening to Tranka's words, it was rare for him to relax a little. He reached out to pick up the parchment and looked at it. He whispered, "Advanced agility, intermediate magic, excellent quality six-eyed flower, and hidden spirit mushroom? This is an unexpected gain. Where are the potions?" Although Ansadin was a pharmacist, he didn't need to personally make such materials because the level of the potion itself was not high. However, he collected these potions for future plans. In other words, it was a strategic reserve. Tranka lowered his head and continued to answer. "A total of 7 bottles of potions have been placed in the Pharmacist Guild and stored in your special storage box. And the news I received is that the 2 mercenaries will bring new herbs after a period of time. The quality will not change, and they said that they want to cooperate for a long time. Bring them here tonight, dead or alive." Ansadin ordered expressionlessly, and then rolled up the parchment. "Cooperation? I don't have that time. You may leave." "Yes, Lord Ansadin." Viscount Tranka bowed and left, never raising his head from beginning to end. Ansadin put the parchment aside. When he turned around, the ground under his feet had been occupied by a huge puppet core magic circle. At this time, there were 30 to 40 pieces of magic crystal on the table, and the puppet sculptures were piled up like a small hill on the ground. On another shelf, there were rows of potions that Ansadin had specially prepared, including Extreme Mana Potion, Awakening Potion, Flower of Wisdom Potion, Graveyard Moss Potion, and so on. He held the Ashgrey Elder Wand in his hand. Before he began to cast the spell, Ansardin glanced at a corpse on the other side of the tomb, and his eyelids trembled slightly. Although he didn't want to immediately restore Magda's body, but after last night, he still had a trace of caution in his heart. The strength of the 13 puppets was enough to wipe out a small town, but even the gargoyles were destroyed by those guys. This was definitely not a coincidence, or luck of the enemy. But he also didn't believe that the villages in the Kingdom of Karen could have such a powerful force. At most, it was done by Wellington, who risked his life. But as a person who wanted to be safe, he wasn't satisfied with the puppet army that he was about to summon next. He forced Tranka to prepare all the materials needed to restore Magda's body, and only then did he feel relieved. "I'd like to see what else a scout captain can do." He waved the magic wand lightly, the light flashed, and the magic circle slowly began to be built. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. On the other side, the door of a tavern in Gigtown was knocked open. The sleepy boss was asked a few questions by a few guys dressed as adventurers in front of him. After receiving a silver coin without batting an eyelid, he hurriedly raised his hand and pointed upstairs, saying something, and quietly hid to the side. 9 people stepped in. Their silent and oppressive aura was far more terrifying than those random mercenaries. The bartenders and waitresses didn't even have the mood to greet them, and they all stepped aside. The door of a bedroom on the 2nd floor was knocked, and the fat man who opened the door while muttering vulgarities was startled. He rubbed his eyes hard, and then put on a respectful expression as he welcomed the people in. The first 3 people stepped in, and the 6 soldiers behind turned around and stood guard outside the door, their hands holding the hilt of their swords, their expressions cold. "Sir Roddy, I didn't expect you to come so early. Don't be so nervous, just give me a simple report of your results." Henry's original sleepiness had long been scared out of his wits. At this time, there were some bottles and jars in his room. The box with the silver coins was locked and stuffed under the bed, and there were a few pieces of parchment on the table with a few lines of words written on it. The handwriting was crooked, but it was barely readable. "Sir, those herbs were exchanged for a total of 7 bottles of potions and 730 silver coins. Their value." Henry whispered what he had done, and then he nervously waited for Roddy's reply. His eyes swept over the 2 tall men beside him from time to time. As a mercenary, he could instinctively sense that these 2 men were strong, but because Roddy didn't have the intention to introduce them, He didn't dare to ask. Roddy reached out to pick up the potions, but his eyes stayed on the potions for a moment, and then he showed a surprised expression, but this expression was quickly concealed by him. After a while, he stuffed all the potions into his bag, nodded and said, "Well done, I will give you an extra 10% of the transaction." Henry's eyes widened, but before he could thank him, Roddy saw the parchment again and asked, "You wrote this?" "Yes, I wrote it, sir. I have learned a little before." Roddy nodded, and his eyes stayed on Buffon, who was still sitting on the bed in a daze, for a moment and then said, "Today, I came here mainly for some new tasks. The two of you listen to it now, and you must finish it before this afternoon." A few minutes later, the oppressive guards in the tavern changed their formation and escorted Roddy and the other two out of the tavern. After they left, Henry and Buffon also paid for the room, and took the box and walked to the other side of the town. Chapter 206. When the sun was high in the sky, the rumbling sound of horses' hooves sounded outside the gate of Viscount Tranca's manor. When the manor guard saw the 9 knights rushing in with murderous intent, they were stunned for a moment and forgot to stop them. However, these knights did not directly break into the manor, but stopped in front of the iron gate. One of them shouted towards the manor, "Let Tranca come out and talk. Baron Sodeler needs him to give an explanation." When these words came out, several guards were shocked. Were these people crazy? Were they going to directly challenge the Viscount's authority? Although the nobles of the kingdom of Karen frequently fought with each other, they had never heard of anyone bringing people directly to the manor to challenge. This was completely out of the norm. If there was a conflict, shouldn't they first spit saliva at some banquet to test the waters? "Who are you?" Although the 4 guards reached for the hilt of their swords, none of these guys had been to the battlefield. They were just ordinary people who had received training. They braced themselves and stood in front of them without any imposing manner. In the face of the question, this group of knights did not answer at all. They just pulled the reins casually and surrounded the gate of the manor in an extremely oppressive manner. This silent threat made the guards' scalps numb. In the past, there were not many soldiers guarding the manor. At this time, there were only 10 of them. Looking at the 9 knights opposite them, they admitted that they could not even last one round at all. Baron Sodeler needs an explanation. Let Viscount Tranca come out. There was no hypocrisy of dealing with nobles at all. The scout at the front repeated the words, full of banditry. The situation was pressing, and the manor guards had to report the news in dejection. In less than 3 minutes, Viscount Tranca came out with a gloomy face. Although he tried to look angry, the fear in his eyes was still hard to hide. He had just returned from Ancidin's underground tomb. He would never have thought that Sodeler would appear at the gate of his manor. If he remembered correctly, Butler Blake had brought 13 puppets to assassinate him. The materials used to summon the puppets were worth a year's tax in Gig Town. His strength was incomparably valiant. Even in the entire territory, there were not many who could exchange more than a few blows with him. They were so powerful that Tranca didn't even consider the possibility of Sodeler's survival. Instead, he was considering whether he should take this opportunity to take over Par. But now he narrowed his eyes and pondered for a moment, trying hard to suppress the uneasiness in his heart. However, his expression changed to one of anger as he strode over and asked with a frown, "What's the meaning of this, Baron Sodeler? Are you trying to attack me, a viscount conferred by His Majesty?" Tranca was prepared to insist that Blake had nothing to do with him. Therefore, not only did he pretend to be ignorant, he even made the first move and made a false accusation. In fact, according to common sense, Blake running to Par Town with his undead puppets and causing a ruckus, anyone who thought with their knees would know that this had something to do with Tranca. But the most powerful thing about nobles was that they could distort the truth. It was not difficult for them to act like a whore while maintaining a chastity. Moreover, Tranka didn't want to completely shake off his relationship with them. What he wanted to do most at this time was to inform Ansadin of this news as soon as possible. As long as Ansadin knew the news, these guys would be walking right into his trap. Thinking of Lord Ansadin's powerful strength, Tranka's original apprehension and fear instantly dissipated. Then, he stood in front of Roddy and the others confidently and continued to ask in an interrogative tone. If I remember correctly, my butler Blake just happened to bring a batch of gifts to Par Town to greet Baron Sodeler a few days ago. Could it be that the Lord of Par Town is using this method to return the gifts? Even Sodeler felt ashamed at his ability to lie through his teeth, but he didn't look surprised at all. Instead, he looked at Roddy with admiration and walked out of the crowd, saying fiercely, "Viscount Tranka, I, Sodeler, have never had any conflict with you. I'm only here to ask, why did you send people to attack me?" His words were aggressive, as if he would start a fight at the slightest disagreement. However, the information in his words made Tranka's eyes light up. Could it be that Sodeler had lost his mind from anger? He only brought these few people to Kyger Town? Tranka was immediately overjoyed. He narrowed his eyes slightly and continued to pretend, "I don't understand what you're talking about, Baron Sodeler. Why would I send people to attack you?" Then, the two of them argued back and forth. The content was nothing more than one side asking and the other not admitting. Sodeler didn't have his usual calmness and cautiousness. From the beginning to the end, he kept asking loudly with a flushed face. He even put his hand on the hilt of his sword several times. The two of them argued without any logic. They didn't seem like nobles at all, but more like village women arguing in the market. Listening to their quarrel, Wellington, who was at the back of the team, curled his lips and said to Roddy beside him, "It seems that everything is similar to what you guessed." Roddy smiled helplessly. He actually wished that he had guessed wrong, but the facts in front of him told him that the undead had already corrupted the kingdom to an unimaginable extent. Even a lord like Tranka had completely become a subordinate. Knight Wellington is right behind me. The 13 puppets were all killed by him. If you are really colluding with the undead, don't blame me for being rude. Knight Wellington will never be lenient to traitors. What puppets? I don't understand what you're talking about. A few seemingly meaningless quarrels actually revealed a lot of useful information, causing Tranka's eyes to flicker with a strange emotion. It was obvious that he was already thinking of reporting the contents to Ansardin as soon as possible. This was also why Wellington admired Roddy. The undead were in the dark while he was in the light. No matter how he thought about it, it was disadvantageous for him. However, Roddy could always grasp the key point and from there, he could control the essence of the battle, confusing the enemy's sight and hearing, creating the illusion that the enemy is weak while I am strong, numbing the opponent's fighting spirit. These inadvertent details all showed that Roddy had a meticulous grasp of the battle. At this time, sitting on the horse's back, Roddy narrowed his eyes and observed Tranka. When Sodeler was almost done talking nonsense, he finally made the horse move a few steps forward and interrupted the quarrel between the two. "Viscount Tranka, we can all testify that Baron Sodeler was attacked, and those damn enemies are not humans, but evil puppets of the undead. This is a fact that you can't refute. So if things can't be handled, I think the Dukes of Angmar will make a decision for us." "Using the Lord's flag to scare people?" Tranka crossed his arms and snorted disdainfully. "Who are you? What qualifications do you have to say this to me?" "My name is Roddy. I hope Viscount Tranka can remember my name." Roddy smiled and looked at Tranka, whose face had changed dramatically. He roughly confirmed a certain possibility in his heart and then silently returned to the team. Tranka was bewildered. "This is the number 1 target that Lord Ansadin asked me to find." The next moment, just as Sodeler was about to continue talking nonsense with him, He almost immediately gave in and did not hesitate to express his willingness to compensate Par with a large number of resources as compensation. He also humbly apologized for his poor judgment. After saying such words, Sodeler no longer questioned him. After cursing a few more times, he finally accepted the compensation. Then he said a few harsh words, turned around and left with the team. Tranka looked at their departing figures and immediately said to his men, "Send someone to chase after them. Remember where they went." After saying that, he hurriedly mounted his horse and went straight to the underground tomb where Ansadin was. 10 minutes later, the underground tomb where Ansadin was located emitted dozens of dazzling lights. Really, a bunch of worms that overestimate themselves. Hearing that Sodeler had only brought 8 people, Ansadin could not describe the ecstasy in his heart. When he heard that Roddy had also come, he immediately summoned 40 puppets in one go. "You only have one mission: kill all these arrogant humans." Ansadin's command echoed in the tomb. The puppet army walked out of the underground tomb with heavy footsteps and an awe-inspiring aura. The gargoyles spread their wings and 4 black shadows suddenly flew into the sky. When the servant who was tracking Sodeler reported the news, the 40 puppets immediately changed direction and sped towards the silent forest. As the summoner of the puppets, Ansadin was still sitting in the underground tomb after the puppet army came out in full force. He leisurely flipped through the book, History of the Plague, in his hand. Only when he occasionally glanced at the large bright magic formation beside him would his eyes reveal some indescribable ruthlessness. Since accepting the mission from His Majesty Augustine, Ansadin had never failed. But after encountering this group of scouts, he actually failed twice in a row. Ansadin understood that if he did not vent his anger, it would be difficult for him to improve his strength in the future. Only by killing all the humans in front of him could his thoughts be clear and his path to promotion would be smooth. Using all the resources to kill the enemy, Ansadin never thought there was anything wrong with it. This was an era where only results mattered. When one had the ability to directly crush the enemy, no one would care about the struggle of the ant. Comparing numbers, "I've never been afraid of anyone." The 40 flashing magic crystal illuminated the tomb. Ansadin's mocking sigh echoed quietly. "Do you think we have enough manpower?" Sodeler, who was fiercely arguing with Taranka in Gigtown, had now returned to his original appearance. But after saying this, he still took out his water bag and drank 2 mouthfuls. Obviously, the after-effects of a dry throat were more obvious. To deal with a puppet necromancer, you either have to kill him before he makes a move or drown him in numbers. Roddy recalled his previous memories and said this while shaking his head. Then he looked back at the distant sky and yawned. "If we go according to plan, there should be no problem. What is that mercenary called Henry Holding? War always burns money. If we want less people to die, we have to keep up with the hardware." Roddy did not directly answer Sodeler's question. Just when he was about to say something else, Wellington interrupted their conversation and pointed to the distance. "The enemy is coming." Roddy did not waste any more words. He raised his hand to cover his eyes and looked into the distance. The black shadow hovering in the sky seemed to have noticed them and had already made a diving motion, ready to fly over here. Good. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.